He didn't even look at her when he said it. Orson Whitlock counted out 4 crumpled $5 bills onto the kitchen table, $20 on for 18 years of cooking his meals, mending his shirts, and swallowing her grief quietly so he wouldn't be inconvenienced by it. And then he turned back to his newspaper like she was already gone. "There's no room for you in my new life," he said. "That's just the way things are." Maren stood in that kitchen doorway, with her father's dovetail saw pressed against her chest, and she thought, so this is what being thrown away feels like. If you've ever been told you were too much trouble to keep or not enough of anything worth holding on to, then you already know exactly how cold that kitchen felt. What would you have done with $20 and nowhere to go? Before we find out what Maren did, and trust me, nobody in Red Hollow saw it coming, if stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things move something into you, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I read every single one. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next at a place called Blackthorn Claim will change everything you think you know about who is strong enough to survive. The morning Orson told Maren she had to leave, the sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge, and the kitchen still smelled like the coffee she'd brewed for him, the same way she'd brewed it every single morning. For 6 years, 2 sugars. Steeped long because he liked it strong enough to strip paint. She had woken before dawn, the way she always did. Not because anyone asked her to, because that was simply the shape her days had taken since her father died. And her uncle had collected her from the churchyard like an afterthought, barely pausing his conversation with the pastor before steering 12-year-old Maren toward his wagon. She'd understood even then, at 12, that she wasn't being rescued. She was being absorbed. There's a difference. And children feel it even when they don't have the words for it yet. Maren set the coffee on the table. She laid out his bread. She went back to the wash basin to start on the morning dishes, and that was when Orson walked in with an expression on his face that she had never seen before, not guilt exactly, but something close to impatience, like a man who has already made a decision and simply wants the inconvenient part of executing it to be over. He was going to marry a woman named Cecile, he said, a widow from back east. Respectable family. Her people had a house, real property, standing in a proper community, not this dried-out corner of the territory, where the wind stripped the paint off everything, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles of bad road away. Maren listened. She kept her hands moving in the dishwater because she found it easier to absorb hard information when her hands had something to do. When, she asked. End of the month. Cecile doesn't. He paused, cleared his throat. She doesn't think it's appropriate. A grown niece living in the house. Her words. It complicates things. Maren turned that over. A grown niece. As though she had chosen to be here. As though she had knocked on his door at 12 years old with luggage and references, and asked to be taken in as a permanent inconvenience. I see, she said. I've been fair to you, Orson said, and she could hear in his voice that he genuinely believed it. That was perhaps the thing that stung worst of all, not cruelty, but the total absence of any understanding that fairness and care are not the same thing. He had fed her. He had kept a roof over her. He had never once raised a hand to her. In his accounting, that was the whole of what he owed, and the ledger balanced. He put the $20 on the table. Maren dried her hands on her apron and looked at the money. Your father left tools, Orson said, already moving toward the door. The saw and the levels and the like. You're welcome to those. Thank you, she said. She didn't cry. Not then. She had learned years ago that crying in front of Orson accomplished nothing except making him uncomfortable, and his discomfort would then become a problem she was expected to manage. So she saved it. She stood very still at the kitchen table after he left the room, her palm flat on the worn wood, and she breathed through it like her father had taught her to do when a cut went too deep and the blood was moving fast. And panic was the most dangerous thing in the room. Breathe. Count the problem. Then work. The problem was this: she was 18 years old. She was heavyset in a way that people in Red Hollow had already decided meant something about her character. She'd seen it in the way women at the general store glanced at each other when she asked for employment, the slight pause before the polite refusal. She had no family left willing to claim her. She had $20. She had a burlap sack, a dovetail saw, a book of desert herbs that had belonged to her mother, and approximately 0 prospects that she could see from where she was standing. She had also, it turned out, something Orson had never managed to account for in his calculations about her father's particular way of looking at a problem. Thomas Whitlock had been a carpenter, a genuinely gifted one, and the most important thing he had ever taught his daughter wasn't about wood or joinery or how to read the grain before you cut. It was this: every structure that looks hopeless has a load-bearing piece somewhere. Find the one thing that's still holding and build from there. Maren picked up the $20 and put it in her pocket. She went and got the saw. Red Hollow was a town that had been almost thriving for about 15 years, which in that part of the territory qualified as a success story. It had a main street with a general store, a post office, a feed merchant, a smithy, a saloon that also served as the town's unofficial courthouse, and a woman named Edna Crowell who ran a dry goods counter out of the front room of her house and knew absolutely everything about everybody within 30 miles. It also had a reputation for being the kind of place where people stayed in their lanes. The miners knew their lane. The ranching families knew theirs. The merchants occupied the comfortable middle lane between them. And people who arrived from nowhere with nothing and no clear category to fit into were looked at with the specific brand of suspicion that small isolated communities develop as a defense mechanism against uncertainty. Maren had been living at the edge of Red Hollow society for 6 years, which meant people knew her face without knowing much else about her. She was Orson Whitlock's niece, the quiet, heavy-set girl. She did his washing, kept his house, didn't cause any visible trouble. She was furniture, essentially acknowledged when useful, mostly overlooked otherwise. She walked into town that morning, carrying everything she owned, and started asking for work. The first door she tried was the feed merchant, a large red-faced man named Garrett, who looked at her the way people look at weather they weren't expecting. "I can lift and carry," she told him. "I'm stronger than I look." He looked at her with a particular expression. She was already familiar with the quick inventory, top to bottom, cataloging her size, her soft face, her worn dress, and she could see the conclusion forming before she'd finished her sentence. "I appreciate the interest," Garrett said, "but I've already got a boy who does the lifting." The smithy was the same story, delivered more bluntly by a man who at least looked mildly embarrassed about it. The saloon, which is despite everything she was willing to consider, for kitchen work, for sweeping floors, for something, sent her away with a look that suggested she'd asked something offensive. She tried 3 more doors, received 3 more variations of the same polite, slightly pitying refusal. By midday, she was sitting on the bench outside the post office, eating the bread she'd brought from Orson's house and trying very hard not to catastrophize. Her father had hated catastrophizing. "Name what you actually know," he'd say, "not what you're afraid of. What you actually know." What she actually knew, she had $20 and nowhere to go. What she didn't know, whether that meant disaster or whether it meant something else that she simply couldn't see yet. That was when she heard the teamsters. There were 3 of them watering their horses at the trough across the street, taking a noon break with the comfortable loudness of men who don't feel any particular need to moderate their volume. They were laughing about something, a specific kind of laugh, that group laugh where everyone is enjoying the joke at someone else's expense, and the person at the expense isn't there to object. She caught fragments, nearly bought the thing himself. Can you imagine? Cursed, they say, ever since the water Blackthorn. Yeah, nobody's touched it in, must be going on 20 years easy. Filing fees just sitting there at the land office, $20. $20 for a piece of ground. Nobody in their right mind would. Maren stopped eating. She sat very still on that bench, and she listened, and the listening felt like something clicking into place, not a warm feeling exactly, more like the sound a lock makes when the correct key finds its tumbler. Precise. Irreversible. She didn't approach the teamsters. She didn't ask them a single question. She stood up, brushed the crumbs from her lap, with the careful, deliberate motions of a person who is managing their nerves by attending to small things, and she walked to the land office. The land office clerk was a thin, balding man named Pruitt who appeared deeply inconvenienced by the existence of customers. He had a stack of papers in front of him, and the manner of someone who had long ago decided that his main job was protecting the papers from interference. "Blackthorn Claim," Maren said. "The abandoned homestead. Is it still on the public record?" Pruitt looked up. He took in Maren the same way. Everyone in Red Hollow did the same quick inventory, and then something shifted in his expression, replacing the initial surprise with what she could only describe as reluctant curiosity. "It is," he said slowly. "Why hasn't anyone filed on it?" Pruitt set down his pen. He seemed to be deciding how much to say, and then he apparently decided she'd find out anyway, and wasting time with evasion wasn't worth the effort. "Water vanished," he said. "Well went dry. There's a story about the family that had it before the husband died. Woman tried to hold on alone, eventually disappeared. People talk about the place being," he waved a hand. "Cursed," Maren said. "Their word, not mine." "What's the filing fee?" Another pause. $20. Maren had exactly $20. She had counted it twice that morning out of a compulsion she recognized as the kind of thing frightened people do. They verify the reality they're holding because the larger situation is too uncertain to look at directly. She put the money on Pruitt's counter. He stared at it. He stared at her. He had the expression of a man watching someone do something he is certain is a mistake but cannot legally prevent. "You understand," he said carefully, "that the water situation at that property is unresolved." "I understand there's a well," Maren said. "Is the claim legitimate?" "The land is legitimate. The water is the claim legitimate." Pruitt took the money. He began filling out the paperwork with the slightly mechanical motions of a man who had removed himself emotionally from responsibility for consequences. He had the papers ready in less than 10 minutes because the truth was nobody had inquired about Blackthorn in so long he practically had the forms memorized. When she walked out of the land office, with the deed folded inside her father's worn vest pocket, the afternoon sun was already dropping toward the western ridgeline, and Red Hollow's Main Street was busy with the ordinary end-of-day movement of people with places to belong. Maren Whitlock had spent every cent she owned on a piece of land everyone else considered worthless. She had a saw, a sack, a book of herbs, and a legal document. She had no food beyond the remaining bread in her pocket, no water beyond what she carried, and approximately 4 hours of daylight left. She pulled her sack up onto her shoulder. She walked. The road out to Blackthorn Claim was 7 miles of hard-packed earth that became progressively less of a road the farther from town it got, until it was essentially just a suggestion, 2 faint tracks through the scrub that the desert was in the slow process of reclaiming. Maren had never been this direction before. She had no map. She had Pruitt's description, followed the eastern road past the junction, looked for the 2 dead junipers standing together on the left, then turn south and walk until you reach the property marker. She found the junipers. She turned south. The desert in late afternoon had a quality she hadn't expected, not silence exactly, but a particular kind of dense quiet, full of small sounds that only became audible once the larger noises fell away. Wind and dry grass. Something small moving in the scrub. The sound of her own breathing, which was heavier than she would have liked. After the first 2 miles, because the ground was rougher than it had looked. And heavier-bodied people feel rough ground differently than they talk about it. She was sweating. Her lower back ached with the specific persistence of a complaint that intended to be taken seriously. She stopped twice, not because she was giving up, but because her father had taught her that stopping on purpose to catch your breath was different from stopping. Because your body had decided for you, and the difference was important for keeping yourself straight about who was in charge. She stood with her hands on her knees, breathing deliberately, looking out at the land spreading away from her in the long desert light. It was not beautiful exactly. Not in the way people wrote about desert landscapes in the novels she'd sometimes borrowed from Edna Crowell's small collection. It was something rawer than that, spare and enormous and completely indifferent, the way wild things are indifferent, not hostile but entirely uninterested in whether you managed or not. She understood that about it, actually. The indifference wasn't something she needed to overcome. She just needed to stop expecting it to care. She found the property marker, a crumbling stone post with a rusted iron ring just as the sun touched the ridge. And then she saw Blackthorn Claim. It hit her differently than she'd expected. Not because it was worse than described, she'd assumed destruction. And there was destruction, but because it was specific destruction, the kind that told you something about the people who had been there before. The collapsed porch hadn't just fallen. It had been held together with repairs for years before it went. You could see that in the remnants. Someone had cared about this place and fought for it before the fighting became too much. The windows were boarded from the inside. That detail hit her hardest for a reason she couldn't immediately explain. Then she understood someone had boarded the windows from the inside, which meant the last person to leave had sealed the house to protect it, not abandoned it in desperation. They had been deliberate. They had been thinking about whoever came after. Maren stood at the edge of her land, $20 worth of what everyone else had decided was nothing, and the last of the sun disappeared behind the ridge. The desert went purple and vast in the instant that followed. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel hopeful. She felt the clean, precise fear of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is only now beginning to understand what irreversible means. She pulled the board from the front door. It came loose easier than expected. Whoever had fixed it had done it to be removed, and she stepped inside. Smell was dust and old smoke, and something underneath both of those, dried herbs or old wood, or just the smell of a house that had been shut against the desert for too long. She stood in the dark interior and waited for her eyes to adjust. The hearth was on the north wall. Still mostly intact, she could see that much. She found enough dry brush near the door to start a small fire. It took her 3 tries with the flint from her pack. Her hands were shaking slightly from cold and tiredness, and the aftereffects of everything that day had been, but the 3rd strike caught and the fire took, and the hearth drew properly. That was the first thing she knew for certain. The chimney was sound. Maren sat suit's floor of Blackthorn Claim with her father's dovetail, saw across her lap, the fire going, and the desert wind beginning its nightly conversation with every gap in the walls. She ate the last of her bread. She drank carefully from her canteen. But tomorrow she would deal with the well. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what kind of trouble she'd set herself into. Tonight she was simply a heavy-set 18-year-old girl sitting alone in a supposedly cursed house in the middle of the desert, listening to the wind, not praying because she'd never found much comfort in that direction, just thinking. Find the one thing that's still holding and build from there. The chimney drew. The fire burned. She fell asleep before the fire went out. The saw still across us, and she did not dream about disaster. She dreamed about water, the sound of it, deep and steady, moving through stone somewhere far below her. In the morning, she would find out whether the dream was just a dream, or whether the desert had been waiting all along for someone stubborn enough to dig. She woke up before the fire was completely cold. That was the first thing, not a triumphant waking, not the kind where you sit up clear-eyed and ready. It was the kind of waking that happens when your body has been cold for several hours and finally decides that discomfort outweighs exhaustion. Her neck hurt from the angle she'd slept at. Her hip hurt from the dirt floor. The saw had left a ridge across her thighs that she'd be feeling for the rest of the day. She lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows, and she took a deliberate inventory, not of her feelings, not yet, but of her situation. It was a habit her father had built into her early. Before you do anything else, know where you are. Where she was a damaged adobe house in the high desert, alone, with no water and no food, and a well that may or may not have anything left in it worth reaching. She got up. The cold hit her immediately, the specific bone-reaching cold of desert mornings that people who've never experienced it don't quite believe in. She'd brought one blanket. She wrapped it around her shoulders and went to the doorway. The door itself was warped, but still hung on its hinges, which was more than she'd expected, and she looked out at Blackthorn Claim in the first light. Most of its windows were dark. The well was maybe 40 feet from the house, set slightly downhill the way sensible wells positioned them to keep groundwater from carrying contamination toward the source. But the stone coping around it was still standing barely, 2 courses of rough granite block that someone had mortared into place carefully enough that 2 decades of weather hadn't toppled them completely. The wooden cover was gone, rotted away, or carried off by wind, she couldn't tell. In its place, a dense tangle of tumbleweeds had packed themselves down into the shaft like the desert was stuffing a sock drawer. Maren walked to it and looked down. She could see about 8 feet before the dry vegetation became too thick to see past. She couldn't hear water. She couldn't smell it either, though that meant less than people thought. Water deep in limestone could be completely odorless until you were nearly on top of it. She picked up a stone and dropped it straight down the center of the tangle. She heard it hit dry brush. Then a second later, something else, a faint, dense sound. Matter hitting matter differently. She picked up another stone and threw it harder, trying to get past the vegetation. This time the sound was clearer. She stood very still, with her hands still extended from the throw. That wasn't dry. It was a small distinction, one sound versus another, separated by barely a heartbeat. But she had grown up listening to her father test surfaces before he worked them, knocking on wood to feel the resonance, tapping walls to find the hollow places, and she had learned to trust what her ears told her. There was something down there. The problem was getting to it. She spent the first hour of the morning pulling tumbleweeds out of the well by hand. This sounds straightforward written down. It was not straightforward. Tumbleweeds that have packed themselves into a narrow stone shaft for years are not the same as tumbleweeds in an open field. They are compressed and interlocked, and their dry branches have the particular hostile quality of things that have been dead long enough to become purely structural. Nothing left of them that gives or bends gracefully, just a lattice of brittle resistance that breaks in pieces and leaves the pieces behind. Her hands started bleeding inside the first 20 minutes. She hadn't brought work gloves, hadn't owned any good ones at Orson's, hadn't thought to buy them because she'd spent every cent on the claim, and the dry branches found every crack in her skin, with the patient efficiency of things that don't have any other agenda. She kept pulling. She got 3 feet down before the tangle became too compressed to pull from above. After that, she had to lean over the coping. Her stomach pressed hard against the granite, which was uncomfortable in the specific way that being a larger-bodied person doing tasks designed for a narrower body is uncomfortable, which is to say it was functionally just inconvenient. And she had no patience for dwelling on it. And use her arms to break the material into sections she could lift out. Her back told her in the 3rd hour that it had opinions about this approach. She stopped, sat on the coping rim with her legs hanging outside the well, hands wrapped around her knees, breathing carefully. The sun was up now, and it had opinions of its own desert sun. In the morning was not yet brutal, but it was making its intentions clear. She needed rope. She needed gloves. She needed a way to get down into that shaft herself, because she was reaching the point where the debris couldn't be extracted from above. What she had, the burlap sack she'd carried from town, one canteen nearly empty now, her father's dovetail saw, her mother's herb book, and the folded deed to this property pressing against her ribs from the vest pocket where she'd put it. She upended the burlap sack and looked at what was inside it seriously for the first time. She'd packed in a panicked hurry. Morning Orson had put the money on the table, not disaster packing, which is what she called the irrational process of grabbing meaningful objects when you're frightened. But she hadn't been entirely strategic about it either. Flint and steel. Good. A short-handled knife, her father's. Good. 30 feet of twine useful, but not strong enough to hold her weight. A spare shirt. 2 yards of cotton cloth she'd originally brought for bandaging. The herb book. The saw. She looked at the cloth and looked at the well shaft, and she thought about what her father would have done with inadequate materials and a problem that needed solving. He would have found the piece in the piece, would have found the piece of the problem that was actually workable and started there. She couldn't get herself safely into the well today. She didn't have the equipment, but she could get more of the debris out than she already had, if she was smart about it. She cut the burlap sack into strips and wrapped her hands. It wasn't gloves, it was enough. She went back to work. By midday, she had cleared 9 feet. 9 feet of compacted, dead vegetation extracted by hand from a 20-foot well shaft, piled in a heap beside the stone coping that was already twice her height. Her arms were burning past the point where burning is interesting, and had moved into the duller territory of sustained complaint. Her face felt tight from the sun. She was rationing the canteen 2 mouthfuls every hour, no more, and the discipline required, for that was starting to become its own kind of distraction. But at 9 feet, she could see a change in the shaft. Below the packed dry brush, the stone walls were darker. Not wet exactly, not yet but different. The color of rock that had seen moisture within living memory, rather than the chalky pale surface of the upper section. She dropped another stone. This time the sound was unmistakable. It hit liquid. Maren sat back on her heels at the edge of the well and felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite relief, because relief implies the fear is over, and the fear was nowhere near over. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a hypothesis confirmed, the fragile, precise satisfaction of discovering that what you suspected was true actually was. The well wasn't dry. The well had been blocked. There was a difference, and the difference meant everything. She needed to get down there. She needed rope, real rope, and someone to manage it from above while she worked, because going down a well alone with nothing but twine was a way to become the next piece of debris at the bottom of someone else's abandoned property. Her father had been specific about this. Know the difference between brave and stupid, because they can look identical from the outside, which meant she needed to go back to Red Hollow. She needed things she didn't have, and she had nothing left to buy them with. She thought about that for a long time, sitting by the well in the noon heat, not in a panicked way, but in the deliberate working through. It way that she'd trained herself toward. The problem was real, and she wasn't going to solve it by wishing it wasn't. What were the actual options? She could try to borrow, but she had no relationships and borrowing against 6 years of living in Orson's household had not exactly built her a social network who trusted her for much. She was the quiet, heavy girl who kept mostly to herself, and now she was the girl who'd bought the cursed claim, which was either brave or insane, depending on who you asked, and neither version made her a better credit risk. She could offer labor, but the morning before had demonstrated pretty clearly how much demand there was for her labor, at least until she'd proven something that she hadn't proven yet. She could find something on the property worth trading. She sat with that thought, turned it over the way you turn a coin, checking both sides. The house needed to be gone through properly. She'd been so focused on the well that she hadn't done a real inspection of the interior beyond confirming the hearth worked and the floor was more or less intact. Abandoned homesteads sometimes held things not because people buried treasure. That was mostly a story for children's, but because people who were struggling held on to things and then left in a hurry or died before they could take them. Tools, stored goods, material worth something to someone. She stood up. She went inside. The systematic search of Blackthorn Claim's interior took her the better part of 2 hours, and it was mostly disappointing, in the way reality tends to be mostly disappointing when you're looking for something specific. She found a rusted iron hook she couldn't immediately identify the purpose of. She found 3 clay pots, 2 cracked and 1 intact. She found a rotted canvas bundle that fell apart when she touched it and turned out to have been a spare set of curtains once, a very long time ago. The east wall of the main room had a hearth, and the hearth had a firebox, and the firebox was built on a flagstone floor. Standard construction for this region, she'd seen the same thing in Orson's house, in the houses of several people she'd done chores for over the years. The flagstones were big, rough-cut pieces of local sandstone, not laid with any particular elegance, but laid solidly, fitted together with the practical competence of someone who cared more about the floor lasting than about it looking beautiful. She was crouched examining a section of the wall beside the hearth, checking the mortar, which was her father's habit. You always check the mortar first, because it was the first thing to fail and the most informative about what had failed when she noticed one of the flagstones. It wasn't loose exactly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no visible gap around it, no obvious disruption in the pattern. What there was a very slight difference in the way it sat relative to the stones around it. A tiny elevation on one edge, barely the thickness of a finger, that caught the light at a certain angle and suggested that this stone had been lifted and replaced more than once. Maren set down the mortar she'd been examining. She stared at that flagstone for almost a full minute. Then she got the knife from her pack and worked it into the edge. The stone moved. Not easily, it was heavy sandstone, and she was working with an inadequate tool, but it moved. She got 2 hands under the edge and lifted, and the stone came up with the reluctant heaviness of something that has been in one place for a long time and has opinions about being disturbed. Beneath it, set into a depression in the earth, was a tin box, not large, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with a simple clasp that had corroded slightly but gave way when she pressed it. She sat back on her heels and opened it and looked at what was inside, and for a moment she did nothing at all, just looked. Banknotes. Old ones, the kind that had been in circulation a decade or more ago, their edges soft with age. She didn't count them immediately. That felt somehow premature, like counting winnings before the hand was finished, but there were a lot of them. Underneath the notes, a small number of silver coins. And beneath those, two other things, a hand-carved wooden bird, a hawk or maybe a falcon, small enough to fit in her palm, made with considerable care by someone who knew what they were doing with a blade. And a sealed letter, the paper yellowed but not brittle, addressed in a careful copperplate hand, to whoever finds this and needs it. Maren set the wooden bird on the floor beside her knee. She opened the letter. The handwriting was a woman's, or at least it had been taught in the style that women of a certain generation were specifically instructed in. That careful, backward slanting copperplate that suggested hours of practice at a young age. But there was nothing careful about the sentences themselves. They move the way someone writes when they've been alone for a long time and have something they need to say to another human being, even if that human being hasn't arrived yet. "My name is Lenora Bellamy," the letter began. "I lived at this claim for 31 years, first with my husband Edmund, and then alone after he died of the fever in our 9th year here. I am writing this because I am old now, and my legs won't carry me much further, and I know I will leave soon, and I know nobody from town will come before I go because nobody from town comes at all anymore. And that is partly because of the story about the water." Maren read slowly. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving around the corners of the adobe, with the busy searching quality that wind has in the desert, as though it's looking for something it put down somewhere. "The water did not vanish," Lenora wrote, "though well filled with debris after the bad storm of 1863, the same way things fill and stop working when they are not maintained. I was too old and too alone to clear it myself. I began carrying water from the creek 2 miles east, which I did for 11 years until my legs gave out. When I could not carry water any longer, I made arrangements to leave. I want whoever comes to know that this land is not cursed. It is only abandoned. Those are not the same thing." Maren put the letter down on her knee and breathed. "They're not the same thing." She picked the letter back up and kept reading. "I saved this money over 30 years, Lenora continued. "I have no children. Edmund's family is gone. I have no one to leave it to and no use for it anymore, and I thought, leave it for whoever needs the place badly enough to stay. Not someone who buys it on speculation. Not someone who wants the land for something it isn't. Someone who needs a home and is willing to do the work for it. If you are reading this, then you cleared enough of the house to find the hearthstone, which means you are already doing the work. So this is yours now. Use it well. Don't leave the hawk behind. Edmund made it the 2nd winter we were here. I'd like to think it goes on living somewhere." The letter ended there. No formal closing. Just Lenora Bellamy's name, signed with a slight tremor in the letters that suggested age, and beneath it a date 14 years ago. 14 years this box had been sitting under that flagstone. 14 years Blackthorn Claim had been waiting for someone. Satson sat on the dirt floor of that old adobe house, with the letter in her hands and the wooden hawk beside her knee, and she felt something she didn't have a word for at first. It took her a moment to identify it, because it wasn't an emotion she had a lot of practice with. It was the feeling of being understood by someone who had never met her. Lenora Bellamy had not known Maren Whitlock would come. She had not known anything about her, not her name, not her face, not the specific way her uncle had put $20 on a table that morning and turned back to his newspaper. But she had known the shape of whoever would eventually come. Stubborn enough to stay, willing to do the work. Nobody with better options. Maren counted the money. $320 in banknotes and silver. She sat with that number for a long moment. $320 was not a fortune. But in that place and at that time, it was enough to buy rope and lumber and glass and lime and seeds and food and tools and roofing materials and still have something left over. It was enough, if she was careful and didn't make stupid decisions, to actually rebuild this place. She had come to Blackthorn Claim with nothing but a saw and a piece of paper. Lenora Bellamy had left her a fighting chance. She spent one more night at the claim before going back to town, not because she had any more resources to work with, but because walking 7 miles in the dark was genuinely dangerous terrain she hadn't learned yet, and because she wanted one night to sit with what she'd found before she had to think about how to use it. She built the fire again. She ate nothing because she had nothing left to eat, which was a problem she could feel in the particular hollow way hunger makes itself known after a day of hard physical labor. She drank the last of the canteen water in 2 careful mouthfuls. She sat by the fire with the wooden hawk in her hand, turning it slowly in the firelight, studying the work. Edmund Bellamy had been good with a blade. The wings were crossed over the body in a resting position, which was a harder thing to carve than wings in flight. Flight was forgiving. You could simplify the shapes and the eye filled in the rest. But resting required you to understand the actual geometry of folded feathers, the way they layered and stacked against each other. He had understood it. Every line on this bird was in the right place. She thought about the two of them, Lenora and Edmund, starting out here, building the well, and the house and the garden and fighting the desert together. 9 years, and then Edmund was gone, and Lenora had stayed. 31 years alone on this land, carrying water 2 miles each way with aging legs because she wasn't willing to let the place that had been their home become nothing. Maren thought about stubbornness, about what it actually meant. In practice, not the romantic version, not the versions in stories where stubbornness is always proven right quickly and the protagonist's resolve is tested just enough to make the victory satisfying. The real version. 11 years of carrying water. The real version was often just refusing to stop day after day, without any guarantee that the refusing was going to pay off. She fell asleep holding the hawk, the same way she'd fallen asleep the night before, with the saw across her legs. She woke up with her mind already working. The walk back to Red Hollow took her 2.5 hours, and she spent most of it making lists, in her head, not written lists. She'd learned to hold lists mentally, because paper was expensive, and the habit of using it casually felt like a luxury. She hadn't earned of exactly what she needed, in what order, at what cost, based on her memory of prices at the general store and the feed merchant. Rope, first. Good rope, enough to go twice the depth of the well with margin to spare. That would run her $1.50, maybe $2. Lumber for the porch and the roof. That was going to be the big cost, and the one she had least control over, because Garrett, at the feed merchant, had the only significant lumber supply within reasonable distance, and she had no existing relationship with him beyond a polite rejection. She'd need to negotiate. Glass for the windows. Lime for the plaster and mortar. Food. Seeds, desert-adapted varieties, the kind her mother's book described, not the soft climate crops that would demand more water than this land could provide. She walked through the numbers, slowly, cross-referencing, against what she remembered of prices and what she knew about what was possible in what order. She ran the calculation 4 different ways, and 4 different ways she came out, in roughly the same place. She could do it. Not comfortably. Not with any cushion for mistakes, which was a concern because mistakes happened and the desert didn't offer much grace for them. But the arithmetic was workable if she was precise. She came over the last rise, and Red Hollow appeared below her, laid out in the morning light, its main street already busy with early day movement. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful. She pulled herself straight, adjusted the sack on her shoulder. She'd put the tin box inside it, the money distributed between the box, her vest pocket, and a fold she'd made in the waistband of her skirt, because putting all of it in one place felt like the kind of thing a person did when they hadn't fully thought about consequences. And she started down toward town. She went to the general store first. The woman behind the counter was Edna Crowell herself, which Maren had hoped for because Edna was at least someone who had acknowledged her existence over the years, occasionally purchasing mending work from her when Orson had permitted Maren to take small paid jobs. Edna was in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed, with the particular quality of a woman who had built something to the store, her reputation, her position in the town's social structure, through careful, consistent work, and had the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she'd done and how hard it had been. She looked at Maren the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see. "You're back," she said. "I am. I heard you filed on the Blackthorn Claim." Edna said it neutrally, without the particular flavor of pity or mockery, just a statement of fact she was confirming. "I did." Maren put her list on the counter. It was actually written. This time she'd torn a strip from the edge of the letter's envelope and written in tight small script with the charcoal from the fire. "I need these things. I have money. I want to know if you can order what you don't stock and what the timeline would be." Edna picked up the list. She read it with the focused attention of a merchant doing actual calculations, which Maren appreciated. No performance of skepticism, no visible commentary on whether this seemed reasonable. Just the list being evaluated as a list. Rope and basic tools I have, Edna said. Lumber you want, Garrett. Glass has to be ordered, and that's 2 weeks minimum. Could be 3. Seeds. She turned the list sideways to read the desert variety notation Maren had added. You know your plants? My mother did. I have her book. Edna looked up at her then. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not warmth exactly, but a calibration. Like a scale that had just received new weight and was settling into a different position. You have money, Edna said. Yes. Actual money. Maren put $40 on the counter. Not the whole amount she'd decided on the walk-in, that she wasn't going to lay out the complete sum anywhere publicly. Not yet. Not until she understood better how Red Hollow was going to respond to the idea of her having resources. $40 was enough to establish that she was a serious customer. Not so much that it invited questions she wasn't ready to answer. Edna looked at the money. She looked at Maren. Something was working behind her eyes, not suspicion exactly. More like the complicated arithmetic of a woman reassessing a situation she'd thought she understood. I'll take your order, Edna said. Garrett at the feed merchant was harder. He was not a bad man. She'd thought about this on the walk, tried to be honest with herself about it, because she'd found that deciding people were bad ahead of actually understanding them was a habit that mostly cost you information. Garrett had refused her work the day before yesterday because she looked the way she looked, and he'd made assumptions based on that, which was common and wrong, and something she'd had to navigate her entire life. But common and wrong didn't necessarily mean bad. It meant limited. He was limited. She needed him anyway. I need lumber, she told him. Good pine for a roof structure, some board for the porch work, and I'll need it delivered out to the Blackthorn Claim. He stared at her. The Blackthorn Claim. That's what I said. That land is, she said, as of 3 days ago. I have the deed. He didn't ask to see it. She noted that he didn't ask to which meant part of him had already heard and confirmed it through the channels by which information moved in Red Hollow, which was fast and comprehensive and largely invisible to the people it was moving about. You found money somewhere, Garrett said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was the statement of a man who has a theory he's not sure he should voice. Maren looked at him evenly. I'm a paying customer, Mr. Garrett. Am I buying lumber or not? There was a pause. Garrett scratched the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as men's habitual stall while thinking movement. And then he named a price. It was too high. She knew it was too high because she'd been pricing lumber in her head for hours, and she knew what the materials were worth. That's 20% over what the wood is worth, they said. And we both know it. I'll pay fair price and I'll pay cash today. Another pause. Longer this time. Fair price, he said, and named another number. That one I'll take, she said. She paid him. She arranged the delivery. She was outside the feed merchant in 12 minutes, and she stood in the street for a moment in the sun, feeling the particular combination of tired and wired that follows any negotiation where you weren't sure which way it was going to go. Across the street, 2 women she didn't know by name were watching her. She recognized the look from a distance, not hostility, something more complicated. The specific expression of people watching a story develop that doesn't fit the version they'd already told themselves. She'd given them a new version to consider. She supposed she'd be finding out what they decided to do with it. She was loading her purchased supplies into a hired handcart when she heard the voice. That's a lot of rope for one person. She turned. Skissees. The man standing there was perhaps 60 years old, narrow and weathered in the way that the desert made people narrow, and weathered over decades of exposure, not thin from deprivation but compressed, as though the elements had removed everything inessential and left only what was actually required. He had a prospector's hat and the unhurried stance of someone who'd spent enough years in his own company that other people's presence or absence was roughly equivalent to him. Cyrus Wren, he said, not extending his hand but nodding at her in a way that substituted for it. She'd heard the name. Everyone in Red Hollow had heard the name. Old Cyrus Wren's Wren, who'd prospected the eastern hills for 40 years and found enough silver to live on but not enough to retire on, which he seemed to consider a reasonable outcome. He came into town twice a month, bought what he needed, said what he thought left. Maren Whitlock, she said, I know who you are. Bought the Blackthorn place. He said it the same way Edna had factually, without varnish. You're planning to go down the well yourself. It wasn't a question. I am, she said, by yourself. She paused. That's what I was planning, yes. Cyrus Wren squinted at her with the focused expression of a man who has made a career out of evaluating terrain. That's stupid, he said, without any particular heat. A wet well shaft alone with one rope and no one above. That's how the Bellamy woman's husband died. Maren went very still. Edmund Bellamy died of fever, she said. The letter said. The letter Lenora wrote said. What Lenora wanted said, Cyrus replied, and there was something careful in his voice now. Edmund went down the old shaft the winter before the fever. Came up wrong. He recovered from what happened in the shaft, but his lungs weren't right after. And then the fever found him. He shrugged, the shrug of a man reporting facts rather than drama. I'm not saying the well killed him. I'm saying a wet shaft alone will solve your problem for you in ways you won't enjoy. She looked at him. He looked at her. Are you offering to help? She asked. I'm offering to tell you about adobe construction and proper well work, which I know considerably more about than most people in this territory, he said. Whether that constitutes help is a matter of semantics. He paused. Come find me when you're ready to go back out. I'm at the North Camp most mornings. He walked away without waiting for her to answer. Maren watched him go. Then she turned back to her handcart and the considerable pile of materials she'd spent the morning acquiring, and she thought about what it meant an old man who had no obvious reason to involve himself, offering his knowledge to a heavyset 18-year-old girl that Red Hollow had mostly decided was a problem waiting to happen. She thought about Lenora. Leave it for whoever needs the place badly enough to stay. Most of its instincts, maybe the same instinct that moved Lenora, was moving Cyrus Strand to stop and trim the street and tell an 18-year-old she was about to make a fatal mistake. Or maybe he was just a blunt old man who couldn't watch someone walk into a known danger without saying something. Either way, she had rope, she had lumber on order. She had seeds and lime, and the better part of Lenora Bellamy's savings still carefully distributed across her person. She had a property marker in the desert and a deed in her pocket and a wooden hawk in her sack and a woman's letter that said this land had never been cursed. It had only been misunderstood. And now it appeared she had something she hadn't expected. Someone who knew how to build with adobe. The handcart was heavy. 7 miles of desert road back to Blackthorn, and the afternoon sun already fully committed to its opinions. Her hands were still wrapped in strips of burlap, the cuts from the tumbleweed branches, not yet healed, and her back still carried the memory of yesterday's work in the well shaft. She got behind the handcart and pushed. It took everything she had to get it moving on the uneven ground. For a moment, it resisted completely, the wheels sitting in loose dirt, and she had to shift her weight and dig her heels in and push not just with her arms, but with the full weight of her body. And even then it moved only grudgingly. Then it moved. She pushed it out of Red Hollow with the afternoon sun on her back and the desert road ahead of her, and the full knowledge that none of what came next was going to be easy. The well still needed to be cleared. The roof was still failing. The porch was still collapsed. The glass wasn't coming for 2 weeks. She had no idea yet what the soil was actually going to produce, or whether the water she'd heard down in that shaft was going to be sweet or brackish, or barely enough. She had no idea what Red Hollow was going to decide to do about her. But behind her, she heard nothing, no laughter, no comment, no one calling after her, with the particular amusement of a community watching what they expect to be a swift and instructive failure. Just the sound of her own footsteps and the creak of the cart wheels and the wind moving through the desert brush along the road. She kept going. Cyrus Wren showed up at Blackthorn Claim 3 days later, which was 2 days after Maren had expected him, and 1 day after she'd started to think he wasn't coming at all. She was on the roof when he arrived, or rather, she was on what passed for the roof, which was a more complicated situation than that phrase implies. The rear section of the structure had lost enough of its timber supports that 2 of the main beams had sagged inward, pulling the adobe parapet with them and leaving a gap roughly 4 feet wide that was currently covered by the canvas she'd jury-rigged for materials in the handcart, which was adequate for keeping out direct sun and absolutely not adequate for keeping out rain, and the sky to the northwest had been building the kind of cloud formations that the desert produced before it demonstrated its opinions about human presumption. She'd been up there trying to assess exactly how bad the beam situation was before she committed to a repair approach, because she'd learned from her father that the fast way to make a structural problem worse was to start fixing it, before you understood what was actually failing. You had to know what the load was and where it was going before you started rerouting it. She heard the horse and looked down. Cyrus sat on a dun-colored animal that looked as weathered and economical as he did, and he was studying the roof situation with the focused expression of someone running his own assessment. "Worse than it looks from the road," he said, by way of greeting. The rear section, she confirmed. 2 beams. The front is holding. The front is holding because the front wall is 3 inches thicker than the back. Whoever built this originally knew what they were doing. The back corner was probably a later addition. He swung down from the horse with the slightly effortful movement of a man whose joints had strong opinions about mornings, and east of its windows were tents, and he stood with his hands on the structure, with the particular squinting attention of someone who had spent 40 years reading terrain. "You been up there long?" "Since first light." "You eat anything?" She had not eaten anything since the night before, because she'd been rationing more carefully than was probably medically wise. But she wasn't going to lead with that. "I'll eat when I come down." Cyrus made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. He tied the horse to the old iron hook on the post near the collapsed porch she'd identified, the hook's purpose, after all. It was a hitching post anchor, which she should have realized immediately, but hadn't, and he walked a slow circle around the building's perimeter without saying anything. She watched him from the roof. He stopped at the well, looked down it, looked back up at her. "You cleared more," he said. 12 feet now. You go down yet?" "No. Waiting for you the way we discussed." "We didn't discuss it. I said, come find me when you were ready." "I came and found you the next morning," she said. "You weren't at the north camp. I was at the south camp." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me you had us a south camp. I didn't think you'd move that fast." He said it without apology, but there was something in his expression, a slight recalibration. Similar to what she'd seen in Edna Crowell, that told her the speed had registered as information he hadn't expected. "I'm here now." "Yes," she said. "You are." She came down from the roof using the ladder she'd constructed from salvaged timber. It was an ugly ladder, not the kind her father would have been proud of, the rungs uneven and the lashing improvised, but it was functional, and that was the requirement right now, and she stood on the ground and looked at Cyrus Wren in the full daylight. He was looking at her hands. The cuts from the tumbleweed clearing had most scabbed over, but her palms were still a map of the last several days' raw places, dark lines from the debris, the particular bruising that came from the edge of stone coping, pressed repeatedly against skin that wasn't built for it. "You've been doing all this alone," he said. "That was the situation, yes. I'm not asking a question," he said. "I'm establishing a fact." He pulled a flour sack from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Eat something, then we'll talk about the well." The flour sack had biscuits in it, real biscuits, not the flat, hard kind, but actual soft ones, with a little lard in them that meant they'd kept overnight without going to sawdust, and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth, and 2 hard-cooked eggs. Success. Maren sat on the stone coping of the well with the sack in her lap, and she ate with the controlled speed of someone who is very hungry and is trying not to demonstrate exactly how hungry. Cyrus sat on an upturned crate she'd salvaged from inside the house and watched the desert, and didn't watch her, which she appreciated more than she would have been able to say directly. After a while, he said, "Tell me what you know about the water." She told him. The stone sounds at different depths. The way the wall color changed below 12 feet. The smell, she'd noticed a smell, not bad, just different, the particular mineral coolness of rock that had been in contact with water not too long ago. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing she appreciated. "Limestone shelf," he said when she finished. "The whole eastern ridge is limestone underneath. Water moves through it from the snowmelt up in the high country, takes 2-3 years to work its way down this far. The well isn't dry because the source dried up. The source is fine." He looked at the shaft. "It's blocked with debris and sealed with silt. You get through that, and you've got good water. You're probably looking at 15, 16 feet more. So I need to go down. You need to go down. And you'll manage the rope." He looked at her with an expression that she was starting to understand as his version of something like respect. The kind that doesn't announce itself. "I'll manage the rope," he said. Going into the well was the most frightening thing Maren had done in a life that had not been without frightening things. She understood, standing at the edge of the shaft, with the rope tied around her chest, and Cyrus's gloved hands braced behind her on the coping, exactly why her father's rule about the difference between brave and stupid mattered. The shaft was 24 inches across. She was not a narrow person. Getting herself down into it required a deliberate physical negotiation with the stone walls that left no room for anything resembling grace. And the first 8 feet, the section she'd already cleared, were fine. But below that, where the remaining debris began, the walls were slick, in a way that made her skin go cold even before she understood why. Wet, she called up. That's good, Cyrus called back. His voice had a different quality through the stone cylinder, flattened and specific. That's the water working up. She worked with the short-handled knife and a piece of the iron hook she'd fashioned into a crude scraper, breaking up the impacted debris layer by layer and passing material up through the shaft in a canvas bucket on a separate cord. It was slow. The cold intensified as she descended, which was both welcome. The desert heat was a distant memory within the first few feet and unsettling, because cold in a well shaft had associations she was trying not to think about. She thought about Edmund Bellamy instead. He had gone down this shaft too. He'd come up wrong, Cyrus had said, and she thought she understood now what that meant. It wasn't the water that got him. It was the weight of it, the way a narrow shaft could close around you, psychologically, if you let it. The way the stones pressed in from both sides in a way that had nothing to do with actual pressure and everything to do with the animal part of your brain that did not like being inside a rock hole. She did not let it. She focused on the work. Break, scrape, lift, pass up. Break, scrape, lift, pass up. She narrated the process to herself in her father's actual voice, the way it had sounded when he was working and explaining simultaneously, that patient, methodical commentary that had been the soundtrack of her childhood, and it helped. It was something to hold on to that wasn't the stone. She was at 14 feet when she hit it. The debris below her had been getting wetter and wetter, each layer more compacted than the last, and she'd been working with the improvised scraper, and her hands and periodically Cyrus lowering a second tool, she'd asked for a longer piece of angle iron she'd found in the ruined porch in Tsar when suddenly the layer gave way differently. Not broke apart, gave way. Like pressing on something rigid and finding that it hinges. She heard water before she felt it. It came in fast, not a flood, not dramatic. Just the sudden confident presence of water that has been waiting for an opening and has no interest in being polite about taking it. It came up through the broken debris around her feet in the shaft, and it was cold, genuinely cold the way only deep source water is cold, and she felt it soaking into her boots, and she understood completely and immediately that she needed to come up now. Pull, she called. Pull now. Cyrus pulled. Getting back up the shaft was harder than getting down, partly because she was facing and the rope pulled at her chest in a way that was not comfortable, and partly because the walls were wet now, and her handholds were uncertain, and partly because there was a completely irrational part of her brain that was calculating how fast the water was rising and arriving at answers she didn't enjoy, even though she knew perfectly well that the shaft was 24 inches across, and the volume involved was not going to reach her before she reached the top. She came over the coping on her stomach, Cyrus bracing against her weight with his feet planted wide, and she lay with her face on the granite for approximately 10 seconds, just breathing. Then she sat up. Below them in the dark shaft, she could hear it. The sound she'd first heard from her, first dropped stone, but fuller now, more confident. Moving water finding its level. It's coming, she said. I know, Cyrus said. How long before it's usable? Depends on how much silt runs through first. Could be hours, could be a day. You'll know when it runs clear. He was looking at her with that recalibrating expression again. You all right? Yes, she said, which was mostly true. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she was wet to the knee, and the cold was getting into her bones now that she was out of the shaft, and the heat of exertion was fading. But she was sitting on the coping of her own well on her own land, and somewhere below her, 15 feet down, water was moving through limestone and working its way up toward the light. The land isn't cursed, she said. Cyrus sat down beside her on the coping, which surprised her he'd been standing the whole morning. No, he agreed. It isn't. Lenora Bellamy carried water 2 miles for 11 years because she couldn't clear the shaft alone. That's what actually happened. That's what actually happened, Cyrus confirmed. Maren thought about that for a moment. 11 years of walking 2 miles each way, with water, alone, aging, the town increasingly convinced she was either dead or haunted or both. The stubbornness of it was almost incomprehensible. The stubbornness of it was, in some way, she was only beginning to understand the most important fact about this piece of land. She stayed, Maren said. She stayed, Cyrus said. The water ran clear by the following afternoon. Maren brought up the first bucket, hand over hand on the rope, and she set it on the ground, and she looked at it for a long time before she tasted it. Most of its windows were dark. The water was cold and slightly mineral and completely, unmistakably good, the particular goodness of water that has traveled a long way through rock and arrived with the flavor of its whole journey still in it. She sat back on the ground and let herself feel it for a minute. Just a minute. Then she started thinking about the roof. Cyrus stayed 3 days. This had not been discussed in advance. There was no conversation about it. No offer made and accepted. He simply did not leave at the end of the first day. He unsaddled the horse at the old hitching post and made a camp on the east side of the house where a section of the adobe wall created a natural windbreak, and he cooked over a small fire with the efficiency of a man who had been camping for 40 years and found the whole process entirely unremarkable. He taught her things, not in the organized way of a school teacher, not with any particular pedagogical structure, but in the way someone shares knowledge when they're doing a thing, some alongside you, some commentary and demonstration, and the occasional blunt correction when she did something that was going to cause problems later. The adobe mix was the first lesson. You're going to want to repair the rear wall before you touch the roof supports, he told her. If the wall isn't solid, the beams have nothing to sit on, and all you'll have done is move the problem. I know that, she said. Then why were you planning to start with the roof? She had been planning to start with the roof because the roof was the most dramatic visible problem, and there was a part of her she was honest with herself about this, at least internally, that was motivated by the visibility of the work. That part wanted Red Hollow to be able to see something changing. That part was not her best thinking. I was wrong, she said. Tell me about the adobe mix. The right ratio was soil and clay and straw and water, and the ratios mattered in a way that the wrong combination would demonstrate for you unpleasantly over the following winter, when your repairs cracked and separated from the existing wall and let the cold through in the worst possible places. Cyrus had her mix 3 test batches with different proportions and apply them to a section of damaged interior wall and weight, and the difference was visible within hours as the material set. The middle batch, she said, pointing. The middle batch, he confirmed. The soil out here runs heavy in silica. You need more straw than the standard recipe says. Most people who've tried to repair adobe in this part of the territory used the standard recipe and then wondered why their repairs kept failing. Why didn't anyone tell the Bellamys that? Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Edmund figured it out eventually. By the time he had it right, Lenora was working the place alone, and it was bigger than one person could maintain. She thought about that while she worked the mix. Too big for one person. She filed that information without commenting on it, because she was already thinking about how it applied to her own situation alone, what was manageable alone, and what wasn't, and where the lines were. The rear wall took 4 days to properly repair, patch by patch, working from the base up the way structural logic required. While the patches set, she turned her attention to the collapsed porch, which was a simpler problem. The posts had rotted at their bases, a predictable failure mode for wood set directly into desert soil without proper footings, and she rebuilt it with the lumber that Garrett had delivered. On the second day after her visit to town, dropped at the property marker by a driver, who said almost nothing to her, but did at least carry the load to the wall, rather than leaving it at the road's edge, which she took as a minor improvement in the town's posture toward her. Was cutting post mortises, the dovetail, saw moving through the pine with the steady rhythm her father had taught her. Slow enough to control the line, but not so slow that you let the saw wander when she heard the second horse. The rider was young. That was her first impression, young and slightly awkward on the horse, in the way that people who are competent riders are not awkward. The kind of awkward that came from making a deliberate effort to sit a particular way, which somehow always produced the opposite of the intended effect. He was perhaps 22, dark-haired, with the build of someone who did physical work for a living, not rain but solid. the kind of solid that came from actual labor rather than any intentional cultivation of it. He had a plain face and an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Something between curiosity and uncertainty, the expression of a person who had decided to do a thing and was now in the middle of doing it and was not entirely sure how he'd gotten here. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance and looked at what she was doing with the saw, before he said anything which she noted. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "that's me, Beckett Rowe. I work at the Hartley stable." He paused. Edna Crowell said, he paused again, which she was starting to think was a characteristic of how he moved through sentences. She said you might need someone to help with the heavy lifting, the roof beams. Maren set down the saw. She looked at him. She looked back at the house, at the damaged rear section with its sagging beam situation that she'd been putting off because she knew it was a two-person minimum, and Cyrus, who had stayed 3 days, had finally left that morning. "Edna sent you," she said. "She mentioned it. She didn't send me exactly." A slight pause. "I came on my own." "Why?" The question seemed to catch him slightly off balance, which she suspected was not entirely accidental on her part. She had learned from years of managing Orson's household that the most efficient way to assess what someone actually wanted was to ask them direct questions they weren't expecting, because prepared answers were mostly performances and unguarded answers were mostly true. Beckett Rowe thought about it, which, she also noted, he didn't reach for the first comfortable answer he actually thought. "I helped build a roof once," he said. "When I was 16, for a family whose place burned. A lot of people showed up because there was a reason to show up." He shrugged slightly. Seemed like there was a reason here, too. It was not a sophisticated answer. It was an honest one. "Do you know anything about raising heavy beams?" she asked. "Some. That's not a very confident answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's accurate." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked the saw back up. "Tie your horse and come look at the rear section," she said. "I'll explain what I'm trying to do, and you can tell me if you have any ideas I haven't thought of." He tied his horse. He came and looked. The problem with the rear roof beams was not just weight, though weight was a significant part of it. The problem was geometry. The beams needed to be lifted into position at an angle they were long enough that raising them vertically was not possible in the space available, which meant she needed a way to start the lift low, rotate the beam through the arc, and seat it in the notched supports in the wall at the top of that arc, all without losing control of the load partway through. Her father had built a system for this once. For a barn raising, she'd been perhaps 9 or 10 years old and had not fully understood at the time. She remembered the shape of it, a bipod of poles lashed at the apex, a block and tackle arrangement that changed the direction of the force, and she'd spent the better part of 2 evenings reconstructing the mechanics in her head, working out what materials she had and what she'd need to fabricate. She explained it to Beckett. He listened the way she'd learned to value in people, without the reflexive interjections that said "I know already" before the sentence was finished, just genuine attention. When she was done, he said, "The bipod needs to be braced against something, or it'll walk when you take the load." She looked at him. "When the tension comes on the apex, the legs want to splay," he said. "If they're not braced, the whole thing tips toward the load. You need either a kickboard staked into the ground," or he looked at the wall. "Brackets. Bolt the leg bases to the wall plates. Then the wall takes the outward force." She had not thought of that. She had been planning to stake the legs, and she had been vaguely uncomfortable about it, and now she understood why the soil in this area was not going to hold against that kind of lateral force. "Brackets," she said. "Brackets," he said. It took them a full day to fabricate the bipod and the bracket assembly from the materials she had on hand, and it was not a comfortable day, in the sense that two people who do not know each other doing complex interdependent physical work is always slightly uncomfortable in the early stages, full of the friction of mismatched rhythms and unspoken assumptions about how things should go. Beckett did something with a lashing knot that she did differently, and they had a brief pointed exchange about it that ended when he demonstrated his version holding more cleanly under a test load, and she acknowledged it and moved on. She noticed he didn't make anything of it when she was right, either, just adjusted and kept working. The actual beam raise happened on the second day, mid-morning when the temperature was still workable. Maren had thought carefully about the sequence: load the block and tackle, begin the lift gradually. Beckett managing the guide rope to keep the beam tracking correctly through the arc. Her managing the primary load line at the bipod, the beam rotating slowly up toward vertical and then over into the notched seat on the wall. In her father's version, there had been 6 people. There were 2 of them. Slow, she told Beckett right before they started. Don't try to go faster than the system allows. If something feels wrong, call it. Understood, he said. I mean it. Don't perform strength. Just work the line. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. I understand what you mean, he said, without any particular edge to it. The first beam took 40 minutes. There were moments in the middle of the arc where the load was at the worst angle maximum moment arm on the bipod, minimum mechanical advantage on the block and tackle, and she felt the rope burning through her hands even through the gloves she'd bought in town, felt the particular strain that told her she was close to the limit of what she could physically sustain. She didn't call it. She worked through it because she'd calculated that the difficult section lasted approximately 90 seconds, and 90 seconds was manageable. When beam seated in its notch, the sound it made, that dense wooden thud of timber finding its place, was one of the best sounds she'd heard in her life. Beckett let out a breath. Not a dramatic sound, just the involuntary exhale of effort released. 1, Maren said. How many total? 3 structural. 4 if I do the secondary ridge. He looked at the sun. We can get the second one today. Not with the same hands, she said. My hands need an hour. He looked at her palms. She'd taken the gloves off, and the rope had done its work, and he didn't say anything, which was correct. There was nothing useful to say. He went to his horse and got a water skin and a cloth and handed them to her, and she cleaned her hands without comment, and they sat in the shade of the rebuilt east wall for an hour, eating salt pork and hard bread from what he'd brought and not talking very much. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised her slightly. She had spent most of her life in the uncomfortable kind of silence, the silence of Orson's household, which was the silence of someone being careful not to be too much trouble, not to take up too much space or demand too much attention. That was a silence you inhabited, like a person inhabiting borrowed clothing, always aware of the fit. This was a different kind. The kind that happened when 2 people had just done a hard thing together and were resting from it. The kind that felt earned. Why are you really here? She asked. Not unkindly. She was genuinely curious. Beckett was quiet for a moment. I told you. You told me a version. He looked at the half-raised roofline. I work at Hartley's stable because there wasn't anything else available when I came through 3 years ago. I stayed because he stopped. Started again. I know what it's like to be in a place where nobody thinks you're going to amount to anything, and you haven't figured out yet how to prove them wrong. She waited. I don't know if you'll make this work, he said. Nobody does. But you're trying something that takes. He shook his head slightly. You're out here with a saw and a tin of money, and you're raising roof beams with 2 people and a rope system you designed yourself. That's not nothing. It might still fail, she said. It might, he agreed. But I'd rather be here watching whether it does than back in town watching from a distance. She looked at the desert spreading out beyond the property line, the enormous, flat expanse of it under the afternoon light. A hawk was working the thermals far to the east, too distant to identify species, just a shape riding the heat without apparent effort. She thought about Edmund Bellamy's wooden hawk, sitting on the windowsill inside, where she'd placed it when she first started cleaning the interior. She'd put it somewhere it could see out. We'll do the second beam tomorrow, she said. You can camp on the east side if you need to. There's a windbreak. Beckett nodded. Nothing dramatic. Just the nod of a person whose plan had been accepted and who didn't need it to be more than that. The storm came the 3rd week. She had known. A storm was building for 2 days before it arrived the sky to the northwest, had the particular organized look of weather that intends to be thorough about itself. Not the scattered, bruised quality of afternoon thunderstorms, but something more deliberate, sassing over the course of days rather than hours. She'd seen that sky before, the winter she was 14, when a storm had taken out Tersen's cat and flooded the root cellar, and he'd been foul about it for 3 weeks afterward. She spent the 2 days preparing. She finished the chinking between the new roof timbers using a mixture. Cyrus had taught her a tighter mix than the wall adobe, more clay and less straw, and she checked every joint, every seating, the bracket bolts they'd installed, the ridge line, the section of parapet wall she'd repaired. She had Beckett, who had without explicit discussion, become a regular presence at Blackthorn, arriving most mornings and working most mornings until mid-afternoon and riding back to his stable work in Red Hollow help her tie down the canvas sections they hadn't been able to replace with permanent roofing because the materials were still on order. She went through the interior and moved everything away from the walls in case any water came through. She checked the well cover she'd built a proper cover now, fitted timber on a hinge, sealed at the edges, and weighted it with stones. On the evening before the storm hit, she stood outside in the dropping temperature and looked at the sky and felt the wind change direction, and she thought, deliberately and without flinching, about what would happen if the roof failed. It was an exercise her father had made her do before every major piece of work. Not to be pessimistic, to be prepared. Look straight at the worst outcome, he'd said. Then you're not surprised by it, and you're not spending your energy being afraid of it. If the roof failed, she'd lose the rear section and have to start over. She'd lose perhaps a week of work, maybe more depending on the damage. She would not lose the well, which was the most critical thing. She would not lose the walls, which were sound. She would not lose the materials she'd already purchased. She would not lose the seeds she'd stored in the intact clay pot she'd found in the first sweep of the house, sealed against moisture. The worst outcome was setback. It wasn't ruin. She went inside and built the fire and ate the cornbread she'd made that afternoon and listened to the wind start working itself up, and she did not sleep well, but she slept. The storm arrived before dawn. She heard it coming, the sound of it building from the northwest, winds, the scrub brush, growing from a whisper to a constant, sustained pressure against the walls. And then the first real gust hit the house, like something that had made a decision about it. The adobe held. She felt it hold, not dramatic, not even particularly notable, just the wall being a wall the way a well-built wall is supposed to be. The inside was considerable, the wind finding every gap that hadn't been fully sealed and commenting on it, and the canvas sections of the roof complained loudly and continuously, but they held their ties. She lay in the dark listening and cataloging. The hearth was drawing correctly. She could hear it in the quality of the air near the fire, a good steady pull, rather than the backdraft that meant something was wrong with the flue. The east wall was quiet. The rear section, the section she'd spent the most time on, the repaired adobe and the new beams and the brackets Beckett had suggested, was making a sound she didn't immediately like, a kind of low intermittent creaking. Most of its windows were dark, and she lay listening to it for 20 minutes, trying to determine if it was structural or simply the new material talking to itself in the wind, the way new construction did. She got up at some point and went and stood in the rear room, with her hand on the wall, feeling for movement. The wall was still. The creak was the timber. The timber was speaking the language of new wood under load not failing, just settling. She'd heard that sound in her father's workshop when new pieces took weight for the first time. It was normal, and she'd known it was normal, and she'd gotten up anyway, because that was the difference between being calm and pretending to be calm. She went back to bed. The storm lasted 6 hours at full strength. By mid-morning it had moved on to the southeast, leaving behind a sky that was washed clean and luminously blue, and a landscape that had been rearranged in small ways, debris redistributed, soil shifted. A section of old fence post she hadn't even noticed before, revealed where the wind had cleared around it. Maren stood in her doorway and looked at Blackthorn Claim in the aftermath. The roof was standing. All of it. The front section, the rear section, the repaired parapet, the canvas tie-downs, the ridgeline she and Beckett had set with such difficulty, all of it exactly where she'd put it. The lines still true, no visible failure anywhere she could see from the ground. She walked the entire perimeter of the house slowly, the way Cyrus had walked it that first morning, and she checked every section with her hands and her eyes. The rear wall had a new hairline crack in the fresh plaster, the kind she'd expected, the kind that happened when new material and old material moved slightly differently in their first major weather event, and the kind that was simple to seal and insignificant in structural terms. Everything else was sound. She stood in the desert aftermath, with her heart doing something she couldn't fully characterize, and the bright-washed sky enormous above her. And she thought about Lenora Bellamy, who had done all of this alone and older, and without Cyrus Wren's knowledge or Beckett Rowe's presence, carrying water 2 miles each way and maintaining what she could and letting go of what she couldn't for 31 years. The roof had held. Her roof. The one she'd designed and built and argued with and worried about in the dark for 3 weeks. It tested the desert tested things without warning and without mercy and without any interest in whether she was ready, and it had held. She realized she was shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the releasing of it, 3 weeks of accumulated fear, draining out of her body all at once now that there was room for it to leave. She sat down on the ground in front of her house on the dirt of her own land, and she let it pass through her without trying to stop it or redirect it or manage it into something more presentable. The desert sat around her in the clean aftermath light, indifferent and vast. She sat there for a while. Then she got up. There was the crack in the plaster to seal. The garden beds she'd laid out needed checking after the wind. The well cover had a stone that had shifted. The canvas sections of the roof were holding, but they needed to be replaced with permanent material, and she was going to have to go back to Red Hollow and have a specific conversation with Edna Crowell about expediting the glass order. The work didn't pause for relief. The work was simply what there was. She got her tools. The crack in the rear wall plaster took her one morning to seal properly. She mixed the patching compound the way Cyrus had shown her, tighter clay ratio. Less straw, worked until it had the consistency of something between mud and putty, applied in 2 thin coats rather than 1 thick one, because thick single coats cracked again as they dried, which was the kind of thing nobody told you until you'd done it wrong at least once. She'd done it wrong once, on the interior chimney repair, and had spent an afternoon chipping out her own work and starting over, which was an educational experience she did not intend to repeat. She pressed the compound into the hairline with her fingers, smoothed it with a wetted cloth, and then left it to set, while she went to deal with the garden beds. The storm had moved soil. Not catastrophically, the beds she'd laid out along the south-facing wall were still basically intact, but 2 of the low stone borders she'd set had shifted, and one of the seed furrows she'd prepared for the late planting had been partially filled in by wind-carried material. She spent the better part of an hour resetting the stones and re-clearing the furrows, working on her knees in the thin morning cool before the sun fully committed to the day. The seeds were her mother's strategy more than her own. Maren had not grown up farming. Orseson kept a small kitchen garden that she maintained, but that was maintenance, not design, and she'd spent several evenings with the herb book working out what made sense for this soilness, sun exposure, and this water situation. Her mother had annotated the margins of the book in places, small practical notations in a hand that was nothing like the copperplate formality of Lenora's letter, hurried, slanted, abbreviated in the way of someone who wrote notes to herself rather than to be read by others. Squash wants the east slope, beans fix what corn takes. Don't fight the dry, work with it. Maren had planted corn, squash, and beans in the traditional companion arrangement her mother's notes described, the 3 varieties supporting each other the way the design intended: beans fixing nitrogen, squash shading the soil to hold moisture, corn providing the structure for the beans to climb. She'd planted desert-adapted varieties, the older drought-tolerant types rather than the more productive soft-climate versions that the feed merchant had tried to sell her. Garrett had been slightly skeptical about this. She had not argued with him because she didn't need his agreement, just his stock, and he had the varieties she needed. The seeds were in the ground before the storm. She checked the beds carefully now, pressing her fingers into the soil at intervals to feel for moisture and disturbance, and found that the planting itself had survived. The soil around the seeds was still settled, the way planted soil settled differently from unworked ground. She sat back on her heels in the garden and let herself register that small fact without immediately moving past it to the next problem. The seeds were still there. She went to Red Hollow 4 days after the storm. The glass had arrived. Edna had sent word via passing rider, a courtesy that slightly were dark, because courtesy from Red Hollow in her direction remained new enough to notice, and there was also the matter of additional lime for the second round of exterior plaster work, which she'd calculated she needed before the cold came in fully and made wet work impossible. She walked in rather than taking the handcart, because she was going to hire a delivery for the glass regardless, and the walk something she'd come to think of as useful. 7 miles of desert road gave her time to work through her thinking without the distraction of things that needed doing immediately. She arrived at her own conclusions more cleanly when her body was occupied with something steady and rhythmic. What she was working through on this particular morning was the question of the workshop. The east side of the house, the side with the natural windbreak Cyrus had used for his camp, was a large enough space, properly sheltered, that with a proper roof extension and a work surface she'd have something functional. She had her father's dovetail saw and the other tools she'd acquired. She had skills she'd been using on the house itself for weeks now. The carpentry work she'd been doing, the joinery on the new door frame, the window casings she was preparing for. When the glass arrived, the bracket fabrication she and Beckett had done for the roof was work she was good at, and she was getting better because she was doing a lot of it. Edna Crowell had mentioned twice, in the way that people who are actually communicating something rapid and apparent casualness, that there were things in Red Hollow that needed repair work, and no one in particular doing it. The blacksmith did metalwork. Garrett sold materials. There was no one who specifically did the kind of skilled woodwork and repair that a community of this size generated continuously: chairs with broken joints, tool handles that needed replacing, boxes and crates and saddlebag frames, and the 100 small objects that wore out and broke and needed skilled hands to put right. Maren had been thinking about that. She was also thinking about the fact that her resources, while they had lasted longer than she'd feared through careful management, were not infinite. Lenora's $320 had built and provisioned Blackthorn Claim, and what remained, after materials and food and the hired deliveries, was enough to carry her through winter if she was careful. Spring would require income. She was thinking about all of this when she came over the last rise into Red Hollow and saw Orson Whitlock's wagon tied outside the general store. She stopped walking. It was a physical stop. Her feet actually ceased moving before her mind had fully processed what she was looking at. And she stood on the road for a moment, looking at the wagon and the horse and the familiar shape of the canvas cover, the specific way the left rear wheel sat slightly canted because the axle had been slightly bent since the winter Maren was 15, and Orson had never gotten around to having it properly fixed. He was inside. She didn't need to see him to know that. She had not thought about Orson very much since she'd walked away from his kitchen table. This surprised her when she reflected on it. She had expected to think about him more, to carry the weight of that morning the way you carried things that had hurt you. But the days at Blackthorn had been so fully occupied with immediate physical reality that the past had stayed where she'd put it, behind her, requiring nothing. Now, standing on the road looking at his wagon, she noticed that what she felt was not rage or grief or the particular ache of old injury. What she felt was more neutral than that. Something like the feeling of looking at a place where something had happened and finding that the place had moved on without the event. She walked into the general store. Orson was at the counter. Edna was behind it. There was another woman standing slightly to Orson's left in the way of a person who is with someone, but is performing a careful neutrality about the association, not quite his equal, but not quite a stranger, the complicated physical language of new attachment not yet settled into habit. Cecile, presumably. She was a trim woman in her mid-40s, with the composed face of someone who had organized her life carefully and was watchful about things that might disorganize it. She looked at Maren when Maren walked in the door with the particular assessment of a woman who has learned to evaluate potential complications quickly. Orson turned around. The moment when he registered who he was looking at was visible on his face, a brief sequence. Recognition, then surprise, then something more complicated. The expression of a man who had put something behind him and found it standing in front of him at the general store. He recovered quickly because Orson was fundamentally a man who valued composure. But the recovery itself was a kind of information. Maren, he said. Orson, she said. There was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained more than 2 seconds of content. You're still out there, he said. It was almost a question. Not quite. I am, she said. His eyes moved over her briefly, the same inventory she'd been subjected to her whole life, but this time reading different information. She was tanned from the weeks of outdoor work. Her hands were calloused in new ways. She was carrying herself differently than she had in his kitchen, not hunched into the careful smallness she'd inhabited in his house, but simply present. The way a person stood when they were used to being the only one managing the situation. I heard the well came in, he said. Word travels, she said. Edna, behind the counter, was doing a remarkable job of appearing completely absorbed in her inventory ledger. Cecile said nothing. She had the intelligence not to involve herself in something she didn't have enough context for, which Maren found herself grudgingly noting. That's Orson started. He stopped. There was no sentence after that beginning that was going to serve him particularly well, and something in his face suggested he knew it. I'm glad things are working out, he said finally. Maren looked at her uncle for a moment. She looked at the man who had given her $20 and turned back to his newspaper, and she thought about everything that had happened since that morning the 7 miles walked, the well descended, the beams raised, the storm outlasted, the plaster mixed and applied and mixed again. She thought about Lenora Bellamy's letter, and Edmund's wooden hawk, and Cyrus Rand counts in the street, and Beckett Rowe, asking whether she needed someone to help with the heavy lifting. She thought about what she wanted to say. Thank you for the tools, she said. It was not what she had originally felt when she first arrived at his wagon, but it was what she had arrived at after working it through, and it was true the saw had been essential, and acknowledging what was true cost her nothing. Orson blinked. Whatever he'd been bracing for, it wasn't that. Of course, he said. I need to talk to Edna about my glass order, Maren said. I'll let you finish your business. She moved past him to the counter, and that was the end of it. Not dramatic. Not resolved in any deep sense. There were things between her and Orson that were not resolved and were not going to be resolved by a brief exchange in a general store, and she was clear-eyed enough to know that. But she had looked at him, and she had not needed anything from him. That was different from before, and she registered the difference, without making a performance of it. Edna looked up from her ledger with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something they're going to think about for a while. The glass came in yesterday, she said, all 6 panes. Only 1 cracked in transit. I ordered 7, Maren said, assuming 1 would crack. Edna's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. I know. I'm saying only 1 cracked, which means you have an extra. Good, Maren said. I'll store it. She pulled her supply list from her vest pocket. I also need lime, and I want to talk to you about something else. The something else took longer than the supply order. She laid it out the way her father had taught her, to lay out a proposal, what she had, what she needed, what she was offering, what she expected in return. All of it specific and without decoration. Edna listened, the way Edna always listened, which was with the focused completeness of someone running real calculations rather than performing attention. What Maren had, skills, tools, the space at Blackthorn if she built the workshop extension, and a working knowledge of what the territory around Red Hollow needed by way of repair work, because she'd been listening to conversations in this store for 6 years, without people realizing she was paying that close attention. What she was proposing, that Edna serve as a kind of clearinghouse for repair work. People brought things to the store that needed fixing. Edna noted them down. Maren came in twice monthly to collect the jobs and return completed work. Edna would take a small percentage as a handling fee. The arrangement kept Maren's overhead low since she wasn't maintaining a town presence, and it gave Edna something to offer customers that she didn't currently have. Edna was quiet for a long moment after she finished. You've been planning this for a while, Edna said. Since before the storm, Maren confirmed. I wanted to see if the roof held first. Practical, Edna said. I try to be. Edna turned the ledger to a clean page and picked up her pen. I have 3 things on my list already, she said. Garrett's got a saddle tree that needs a new wooden frame, split at the pommel. Widow Heston wants her kitchen chairs looked at. 2 of them wobble. And I have a packing crate from the last supply delivery that lost its bottom joint. She looked up. Those are your starting jobs if you want them. Maren looked at the list. She looked at Edna Kroll's careful handwriting and the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had decided something and was implementing it. What made you decide? Maren asked. Edna set down her pen. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt considered rather than evasive. I've been running this store for 19 years, she said. You know what I've learned in 19 years? She didn't wait for an answer. Most of its windows were dark. I've learned that people who show up and do the work are considerably rarer than people who talk about showing up and doing the work. And I've been watching you show up and do the work for 6 weeks. She picked her pen back up. That's what made me decide. Maren nodded. There wasn't a graceful response to that, so she didn't try to find one. She collected the glass panes and padded canvas, the transit packaging that Edna had saved, specifically, which was another small courtesy she filed away, and she arranged for Garrett's delivery of the lime. She picked up the split saddle tree from Garrett directly, the first official piece of repair work, carrying it under her arm back through town to the road. She was past the post office and nearly to the edge of town when she heard someone behind her. Miss Whitlock, she turned. The man coming after her was someone she recognized from town without knowing his name, middle-aged, the look of a ranching man, someone she'd seen at Garrett's feed merchant several times. He was holding a leather-wrapped bundle. Someone said, "You're doing repair work," he said, slightly out of breath from the pace he'd set to catch her. It's a tool chest. Dovetail joints on the corners all gave out. I've been holding it together with rope for 2 months. She looked at the bundle. Let me see. He unwrapped it. The chest was good old work. The original joinery had been quality. The wood was sound. It was simply the glue in the joints that had dried and failed after years of use in varying temperatures. A straightforward reglue with proper preparation would fix it, maybe 2 hours of actual work, once she had the joints cleaned and clamped. 3 days, she said. I'll need to take it with me. Clean the joints, reglue and clamp. Bring it back to Edna's when it's done. What do you charge? She'd thought about this on the walk-in. She named a price. He looked at it for a moment. That's fair, he said. He handed her the chest. Name's Aldous Crane. I run the Double C about 8 miles north. You do good work on this. I'll have more. I'll do good work, she said. She walked out of Red Hollow carrying a split saddle tree under one arm and a broken tool chest under the other, which was not the most elegant situation logistically, and she was fairly certain that at least 2 people she passed on the main street were watching her go with the specific expression of people revising a story they'd been telling themselves. She didn't look back to check. The glass installation was the transformation that changed how Blackthorn Claim looked from the outside, and she hadn't fully anticipated that. She'd thought about it in functional terms: light, weatherproofing, the ability to close the house properly, and hadn't thought enough about how a house with windows looked different from a house with boards. Boarded windows said abandoned, said warning, said whatever story the desert and the town had been telling about this place for 20 years. Glass windows said someone lived here. Someone had decided this place was worth the investment of clear light. Beckett helped with the installation. He'd gotten better at anticipating how she worked, not finishing her thoughts or presuming to know what she needed, but simply being aware of the physical logic of what they were doing and positioning himself accordingly. It made the work faster in a way that was hard to quantify, because it wasn't about speed exactly, it was about friction. Less friction meant the work moved through more cleanly. The windows casings she'd jointed and fitted herself, the dovetail corners cut with her father's saw, and she was aware as she worked of the specific satisfaction of using inherited skill on something of her own. Not Orson's house, not anyone else's repair project. Her own windows in her own walls on her own land. She pressed the final pane of glass into its glazing compound and pressed the stops into place and stepped back. The afternoon light came through the south-facing window and landed on the interior stone floor of Blackthorn Claim in a way it probably hadn't landed for 20 years or more. The room looked different. She looked different in it. She could see her own reflection faintly in the glass, heavyset and tanned and calloused-handed, her hair pulled back practically, wearing a working shirt that had been washed enough times to go soft. She didn't look like someone's charity case or someone's burden or the quiet girl in the corner of Orson's kitchen. She looked like someone who lived here. Beckett was cleaning the excess glazing compound from with a rag, and he glanced over at her and then looked at the window and said, "That's the last one." "That's the last one," she agreed. He looked at her reflection too for a moment, then went back to the cleaning. "The house looks like a house now," he said. "It always was a house," she said. "You know what I mean." She did know. "Yes," she said. The saddle tree took her a day and a half, which was half a day less than she'd estimated. The problem was more straightforward than it had initially appeared. Once she had it on the workbench she'd built along the east wall, the split was clean, not a complicated fracture, and the wood on either side of it was sound and hadn't warped. Good clamps, proper glue application, 2 hours of clamping time, and then the careful trim work on the reinforcing piece she fitted across the back of the pommel frame for additional strength. The tool chest took 3 days because the joint cleaning required patience. She didn't try to rush. She used the time between gluing stages to work on Widow Heston's chairs, which turned out to be a more interesting problem than wobbling joints. One of the chairs had a back leg that had been repaired before, badly, with the wrong size dowel forced into an oversized hole and held with inadequate glue, which meant she had to undo the previous repair before doing the correct one. She found herself talking to the chair at one point, which she recognized as a habit she'd inherited directly from her father. He'd talk to his work. Not in any mystical sense, he was a practical man who had no patience for mysticism, but in the sense that narrating a problem helped him think through it. She'd absorbed it without noticing, and now she was alone enough at Blackthorn that there was no one to hear her do it, which meant it happened without self-consciousness. Whoever fixed you before didn't know what they were doing, she told the chair. They made it worse, but we're going to sort it out. The chair didn't respond, which was fine. She delivered everything to Edna's on her next town trip. The saddle tree to Garrett, who looked at the repair with the careful expression of a man who knows enough about a thing to evaluate the quality of work done to it. He was quiet for a moment. Clean, he said. She took that as sufficient. Aldous Crane came in for his tool chest while she was still at the counter. He opened it, ran his hands over the joints, pressed on the corners to test the holding. He opened and closed the lid twice. What did you use on the back reinforcement? He asked. Ash strip, fitted and glued. The crack would have opened again under load without it. He looked at the strip she'd fitted it neatly. It wasn't invisible, but it was trim. The kind of repair that was honest about being a repair without being ugly about it. You thought ahead, he said. That's the job, she said. He looked at Edna. I've got a wagon box that needs the floorboards replaced, and 2 of the frame joints reglued. Add her to whatever you've got going. Edna added it to the list without looking up. What happened next happened gradually the way most real things happen, not in a single moment of dramatic reversal, but in the slow accumulation of small facts changing the overall picture. The repair work spread the way any word-of-mouth service spread in a small community through direct experience, through the multiplying lows were dark, through the multiplying testimony of people who had a thing fixed and mentioned it to the churches who had a thing that needed fixing. Maren's particular quality was that she didn't do fast or careless work, which meant the things she fixed stayed fixed, which meant people came back. By the time the first cold arrived, the real cold, the kind that had teeth, she had a steady, small income from the workshop and a full order book for the winter months when indoor work was more practical anyway. She'd built out the east side extension on the house, not elaborate, just a roofed working space with the bench and proper storage for the tools, connected to the main house so she could work in the cold without losing too much heat. The garden was in its dormant period, but what had come from it through late summer and into autumn had been more than she'd expected and less than she'd hoped, which she understood was the normal range of outcomes for a first-year garden in new soil, and she'd kept notes on everything, what worked, what didn't, which companion, planting placements needed adjustment, which beds would benefit from what amendments. The notes of its Windows herb book, in her own hand, alongside her mother's margin notes, 2 generations of desert knowledge filling the same pages. Cyrus came back in mid-dark. Cyrus came back in mid-autumn. He rode in on a Thursday morning and dismounted at the hitching post and stood looking at the house for a while before she came out to meet him, and the way he looked at it told her something. Well, he said. Come in, she said. There's coffee. She'd built a proper second chair for the main room, one of the first things she'd made once the workshop extension was functional. Because Beckett was spending enough time at Blackthorn that sitting on an upturned crate was past the point of reasonable. Cyrus sat in it with the careful lowering of a man whose knees had filed a formal complaint, and he looked around the interior. The floor was clean, the hearth was burning well. The glass windows were holding the cold out and letting the afternoon light in. On the sill of the south window sat Edmund Bellamy's wooden hawk. Cyrus looked at the hawk for a moment. Something moved through his expression. You know I knew Edmund, he said. She turned from the fire where she was pouring the coffee. You didn't tell me that. You didn't ask. She brought him the coffee and sat on her own chair across the hearth. Tell me now. He turned the cup in his hands. He came out here same age you were when you came. Younger, maybe. He and Lenora built that well together the first year, then spent 30 years fighting the desert for everything else. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good man, stubborn, like most good people. He looked at the hawk again. He made that thing the second winter when they didn't have enough work to fill the days, and Lenora was homesick and he wanted to make her something. Maren thought about that. A man carving a hawk in the second winter of a hard life to give his homesick wife something to look at. The hawk sitting under a flagstone for 14 years. The hawk's sitting in the window of the rebuilt house now, looking out at the desert that had outlasted everyone who'd tried to claim it. Did you know she left the box? Maren asked. No, Cyrus said. I knew she left. I didn't know what she left behind. He looked at Maren over his coffee. How much was in it? She looked at him evenly. Enough, she said. He accepted that without pushing. One of his better qualities. The plaster work on the rear wall, he said instead. You did the two-coat method, the way you told me. The crack on the east corner, sealed the week after the storm. No further movement. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man checking off items on an internal list he hadn't shared. You know what Red Hollow is saying about you, he said. Probably several things, she said. Which one? The corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. That you found money somewhere. Treasure buried on the cursed land. Plenty of theories about where it came from. Maren considered this. And what do you say when people tell you their theories? I say I have no idea where the girl got her money, and the house looks solid, and the roof held in the autumn from storm, Cyrus said. Which is the truth? That is the truth, Maren agreed. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The fire worked steadily in the hearth, the way a fire worked in a chimney that drew properly, which it did because she'd spent 2 days cleaning and sealing the flue in the second week at Blackthorn, before she'd even gotten to the roof, because Harvauser had taught her to prioritize the things that could kill you before the things that merely inconvenienced you. People are going to keep talking about the money, she said after a while. People are going to keep talking about the money, Cyrus confirmed. At some point they're going to ask me directly. At some point they will. She thought about what she would say when that happened. She thought about Lenora's letter. The paper yellowed, but not brittle. The careful copperplate handwriting to someone she'd never meet. She thought about what it meant to keep a secret that wasn't exactly a secret. Lenora hadn't told her to keep it quiet, hadn't said anything about privacy, had simply explained what she'd done and why, and left the decision to whoever came after. Lenora Bellamy left it, Maren said, under the hearthstone, to whoever needed the place badly enough to rebuild it. Cyrus was quiet for a long moment. That sounds like her, he said finally. You knew her? Not well. She didn't come to town much in the last years. But I knew who she was. He looked at the hawk again. She stayed when she didn't have to. After Edmund, plenty of people told her to come back east, sell the claim. She said she'd told Edmund they'd build something there, and she wasn't going to tell him different now. He set down his cup. 31 years is a long time to keep a promise to someone who can't hold you to it. Maren was very still for a moment. She thought about the kind of person who kept promises that no one was watching. The kind of stubbornness that had no audience and no reward, and just continued because it had decided to continue. She thought about 11 years of carrying water 2 miles each way, past the point of sense, past the point of what anyone would have called reasonable, because the alternative was admitting that the thing you'd built was gone. When the time comes, Maren said slowly, when people ask me directly, I'm going to tell them the truth. Cyrus raised an eyebrow. That Lenora Bellamy built this place and fought for it for 31 years and didn't let it go, and the story everyone's been telling about Blackthorn being cursed is wrong, and has always been wrong. She looked at her coffee. The land isn't cursed. It just needed someone willing to stay. Cyrus picked up his cup again. He held it for a moment without drinking, looking at the fire with the far-off expression of someone looking at something that isn't in the room. That'll change things, he said. I know, she said. Red Hollow doesn't like being wrong. No, she agreed. But they don't like being afraid of things either. If there's an alternative, give people a different story that's also true, and most of them will take it. He looked at her. That recalibrating expression again, she'd seen it on Edna, on Beckett, now on Cyrus. This particular adjustment people made when they realized she was doing something more than surviving. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since the first night, she said. When I read her letter, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Edmund would have liked you. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked at the hawk in the window rather than at Cyrus, and she said, I like his hawk. Cyrus finished his coffee. He talked for another hour about the wall work, about winter preparation, about technique for sealing the exterior adobe against freeze-thaw cycles that she hadn't heard from him yet, and when he left, he turned back at the door. Beckett Rowe, he said. He's been out here regular. He helps when I need 2 people, she said. Cyrus looked at her with the expression of a man who has significant opinions and is deciding which ones to voice. He's a good worker, he said finally. Yes, she said. He is. Cyrus left. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride the desert road back toward Red Hollow until the distance made him small. Most of its windows were dark. Then she went back inside to the hawk in the window and the fire in the hearth and the order book on the workbench with its growing list of things that needed fixing. And she thought about what Cyrus had said without quite saying it, that Beckett Rowe was more present at Blackthorn than the work required, and that she already knew that, and that she hadn't said anything about it, because she didn't have clear words for what she knew yet, and she wasn't going to use unclear words just to fill the space. She picked up the next job from the bench. A box hinge split at the pin. Simple work, an hour at most. She sat down and began. The fire kept going. Outside the glass window, the desert afternoon was doing what desert afternoons did, going from gold to copper, saturated blue of approaching evening, and the light changed in the room around her while she worked. Warm and specific, the light of a house with a fire and sealed windows and water in the well. The light of a place where someone lived. She worked until she couldn't see well enough to work anymore, and then banked and shipped the fire, and ate what she'd prepared that morning, and sat for a while in the chair she'd made with her own hands, in the house she'd rebuilt on the land she'd bought with everything she had. The hawk watched the dark desert through the window. She went to sleep thinking about the truth she was going to tell Red Hollow, and what would happen when she told it, and whether she was ready for what came after the telling. She didn't have a complete answer to that yet, but she'd learned by now that readiness was mostly just another word for willingness, and that willingness was the one thing she'd never been short of. The question came on a Tuesday in late November, which was not the dramatic moment she'd been preparing for. She had been expecting it to happen in the general store, in front of people, the kind of public confrontation that small communities staged when they finally decided they needed an answer to something they'd been circling for months. She had been quietly readying herself for that particular theater, the crowd of ears, pretending not to listen. The weight of collective judgment, the specific pressure of being asked to account for yourself to people who had already made up their minds and were simply waiting for your words to confirm or deny. What happened instead was this. She was at Edna's counter picking up her order book for the month's work, and the store was empty except for the 2 of them, and Edna set down her pen and looked at Maren directly and said, "Where did the money come from?" Not a question, a statement requiring an answer. Maren had the order book in her hands. She set it back on the counter. She'd thought about how to say it many times since the conversation with Cyrus in October, working through versions the way she worked through structural problems, identifying the load, finding the honest line, removing anything decorative that weakened the overall thing. She didn't want to be dramatic about it. She didn't want to make it a story bigger than it was. She wanted to say what had actually happened. Lenora Bellamy left it, Maren said, under the hearthstone, in a tin box with a letter explaining what it was for. Edna's was still. Not the stillness of shock. Edna Crowell was not easily shocked, but the suspiciousness of someone integrating new information into a framework that is being restructured around it. She hid money in the house, Edna said. She saved it over 30 years and put it under the flagstone for whoever came next. The letter said she wanted it to go to someone who needed the place badly enough to rebuild it. Maren paused. She was specific about that. Not someone buying on speculation. Someone who needed a home and was willing to work for it. Edna was quiet for a long moment. And the curse, she said. The well blocked in a storm decades ago, Maren said. That's all it ever was. Lenora couldn't clear it alone after Edmund died. She carried water from the creek for 11 years until she couldn't carry it anymore. She said it plainly, without the weight of accusation, because this wasn't about Red Hollow being villainous. It was about a story that had gone wrong and stayed wrong because no one had bothered to look at it directly. The land was never cursed. It was just difficult, and Lenora was alone. And difficult things look like curses when no one comes close enough to see what's actually happening. Edna pressed her fingertips together on the counter. She was thinking in the particular focused way that meant she was not just processing the information for herself, but understanding what it meant for the larger shape of things. People have been afraid of that property for 20 years, Edna said. I know, Maren said. They're going to feel. Edna started again. They're going to have feelings about this. I expect so. You're going to tell them. I'm going to tell anyone who asks, Maren said. I'm not going to announce it like a prosecution, but I'm not going to keep being vague about it either. It's not complicated. It's just the truth. Edna looked at her for a long moment. There was of its expression that Maren had started to recognize over the months of their working relationship, a quality of genuine appraisal, not the performed kind that people put on when they wanted to seem thoughtful, but the real kind that meant someone was actually revising their understanding of something in real time. She was remarkable, Edna said finally. Lenora. I only met her twice, years and years ago. She came in for seeds, I think. She was already old by then. She shook her head slightly. I didn't know she was still out there. She was, Maren said. She stayed until she couldn't. There was a pause that felt different from the earlier silences, less weighted, more settled, the kind of pause that follows the conclusion of something rather than the suspension of it. Edna picked up Maren's order book and handed it to her. You have 7 jobs this month, she said, back to business, which was how Edna processed things by returning to the practical. Crane sent another wagon piece. And I have a new one. A woman just moved in up near the Hartley land. She's got a traveling desk with a broken writing surface. Needs new leather inlay and the hinge rebushed. Maren took the book. I'll look at the desk first. The leather work takes the longest to source. I thought you'd say that, Edna said. The truth moved through Red Hollow the way. Truth moved through small communities, not in a single announcement, but in a spreading, uneven way, one conversation at a time, each version slightly different from the last, all of them circling back eventually to the same central facts. Lenora Bellamy had not abandoned Blackthorn Claim in desperation. Sighed Tzitzis. She had saved her money and hidden it and written a letter and waited for someone who needed the place enough to deserve it. The well had never gone dry. The land had never been cursed. Some people received this with embarrassment, the particular discomfort of discovering that a story they'd been repeating for years was wrong. A few were defensive about it. It had looked cursed. They said nobody could blame anyone for thinking so. You couldn't expect people to go poking around at an abandoned claim just to check whether the curse story was accurate. Maren did not argue with them. She was not interested in relitigating who had done what 20 years ago. She was interested in what was true now. Garrett was one of the defensive ones. She came in for a supply order in early December, and he was behind his counter with the slightly elevated manner of a man who has heard something that made him feel a way he would prefer not to feel. I heard what you're saying about the Bellamy property, he said. All right, she said. She put her supply list on the counter. People had reasons for thinking what they thought. I know they did, she said. I'm not arguing that. He seemed slightly deflated by this. He'd been braced for a fight she wasn't offering. Then, what are you saying? Exactly. I'm saying the well is full, and the roof held the autumn storm and the garden produced through the season, and there's no curse. She pointed at her list. I need the lime, and I need it before the freeze gets worse, or I can't do exterior work until spring. Garrett looked at her list. He looked at her. Something complicated moved through his face, not an apology. Garrett was not a man who arrived at apologies quickly, but something adjacent to one. Something that preceded apologies, people who were slowly working their way toward honesty with themselves. The lime I have, he said. She paid for it and arranged the delivery and walked out. She didn't need his guilt. She needed the lime. Beckett was at Blackthorn when she got back that afternoon, which was not unusual. He'd been coming out 3 or 4 times a week through the autumn. The stable work at Hartley's not being so demanding in the winter months that his time was fully forced. He'd been making himself useful in ways that had gradually shifted from clearly task-related to something less easily categorized. He fixed things that needed fixing without being asked to. He made coffee when she was deep in a repair job and had forgotten to make it herself. He'd learned without announcement what she found useful and what she found irritating, and he'd oriented himself accordingly. She'd been thinking about this. Thinking about it in the careful, unrushed way, she thought about things that mattered, not trying to arrive at a conclusion before she had enough information, but not pretending she didn't notice either. He was at the workbench when she came in, fitting new handles onto a pair of wood planes that she'd acquired from an estate sale, a small batch of old tools that had come to Edna's store in lieu of payment on a debt, and that Edna had sold to Maren for considerably less than they were worth, which was the kind of thing Edna did in a way that was never named as generosity, but was undeniably that. The plane handles were cracked, both of them, the old-turned wood dry split from years of storage. She'd been meaning to replace them for 2 weeks and hadn't gotten to it. And apparently Beckett had gotten to it instead. She stood in the workshop doorway, looking at him for a moment. He glanced up. "Tote first?" "Or tote," she said. "Tote's the one you hold. If the tote isn't comfortable, the rest doesn't matter." He nodded and went back to the fitting. She put down her things and came to the bench and looked at the work. He'd chosen walnut from the small stock of hardwood she kept for quality jobs, which was the right choice, good grip, durable, the right weight for the size of the tool. The fit on the first handle was clean. "You've done this before," she said. "My grandfather was a cabinet maker," he said. "I used to watch him." She hadn't known that. 3 months of working alongside someone, and she was still learning basic things about them, which was not a failure of attention on her part, but simply the way that knowing a person actually worked, not in a revelation, but in an accumulation of small facts that eventually added up to something more complete. She pulled a stool to the bench and sat and picked up the second plane to examine where the new handle would seat. "I talked to Edna this morning," she said.
About the money.
"About Lenora." Beckett kept working. "How did it go?" "Better than I expected." Edna took it the way Edna takes things, processed it, and moved to the next practical matter. She turned the plane in her hands. Garrett was Garrett about it. Meaning? Meaning he's going to feel bad about it for longer than he'll admit, and he'll eventually land somewhere reasonable, but it'll take him a while to get there. Beckett looked up at that. So its scenes were dark. There was something in the way she'd said it, not with bitterness, just with the level assessment of someone who understood people well enough to predict them without needing to be angry about their predictability, that seemed to register with him. "You're not angry at them," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was," she said, "at the beginning. When I was walking door to door asking for work and every door closed." She set the plane down. "But angry at who?" "Yeah, exactly. At people who looked at me and made the same assumptions everyone makes when they look at me." That she thought about how to say it. "That's too many people to stay angry at, and it doesn't accomplish anything I actually want to accomplish." "What do you want to accomplish?" The directness of the question caught her slightly. It was the kind of question she asked other people, not the kind she usually received. She sat with it for a moment. "I want this place to work," she said. "I want the workshop to carry its own weight and the garden to improve every year and the house to stand. I want to be someone people in this territory know they can bring a broken thing to and trust that it'll come back fixed." She paused. "I want to deserve what Lenora left. Not just use it, deserve it. There's a difference." Beckett was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before and not been ready to name. She was closer to ready now. "You've been out here a lot," she said. "I have," he agreed. "More than the work requires." "More than the work requires," he agreed again. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The fire in the main room was audible to the workshop, a steady low sound, and outside the desert wind was doing its usual conversation with the walls. "I don't know what I have to offer," Beckett said, "in terms of I don't have land. I have a job at a stable that pays enough to live on and not much else. I don't have a lot to bring to this." "I didn't ask you what you had to bring," she said. "I know, I'm saying it anyway because it seems relevant." He looked at the plain handle in his hands. "I grew up being told I wasn't going to amount to anything by people who had specific reasons for wanting me to believe that, and I spent a long time half believing them. And then I came here and watched you buy a cursed property with your last dollar and go down a well alone and raise roof beams with a rope system you designed yourself and rebuild a house everyone had written off." He set the handle down. "You make it very hard to keep believing the small version of things." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I like being here. I like the work, and I like watching you think, and I like that you tell me when I'm wrong, and you don't make it mean more than it means." He paused. "I'd like to keep being here." however that makes sense. It was not a speech. It was not a romantic declaration in the form she'd encountered in the occasional novel she'd read. Most of its windows were dark. It was a man telling the truth about himself in clumsy order, because he was more honest than polished, and she had always found honesty more interesting than polish. "You can keep being here," she said. He looked at her. "You're useful," she said. "And you fit. Those aren't small things." The corner of his mouth moved. "In that order? Don't push it," she said, and went back to looking at the plane. But she was almost smiling, and he saw it, and neither of them said anything else about it, because they didn't need to. December moved through Blackthorn, the way winter moved through the high desert, not with the dramatic violence of the autumn storm, but with a slow, relentless cold that seeped in everywhere and required constant management. She sealed 2 drafts she'd missed in the original weatherproofing. She built a second layer of insulation behind the north wall, using the packed clay straw techniques that Cyrus had described. She learned, the hard way, that the water in the well needed the cover weighted more heavily than she'd calculated when temperatures dropped, because the hinged timber expanded slightly in the cold and created a gap that let heat escape from the shaft, and she came out one morning to a skim of ice on the water's surface. She fixed it the same day, added a second board layer to the cover, sealed the hinge side with oiled cloth. Problem resolved, the workshop ran steadily. Cold months brought indoor damaged furniture stressed by temperature changes, wooden handles that had dried and split, the accumulated small breakage of objects that spent autumn and winter in conditions they weren't well suited for. She had consistent work through December and into January. The order book fuller than she had start scheduling jobs 2 weeks out, which was a problem she found she didn't mind having. Cyrus came back twice more before the solstice. He never announced himself, he simply appeared, the dun horse at the hitching post, Cyrus seats. Cyrus at the workbench examining whatever she was currently doing with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in whether the work was being done correctly. He gave notes. She took the ones that were right and disagreed with the ones that weren't, and sometimes he conceded and sometimes he didn't, and the back and forth of it had developed into something she found she valued in a way she didn't have a clean word for. On his second visit, before the solstice, he brought her something. He set it on the workbench, without ceremony, a small paper-wrapped package that turned out when she opened it to be a sharpening stone. Good quality, 2 grit, the kind used for fine tool maintenance. "Your saw's getting dull at the heel," he said. "I noticed last time." She looked at the stone. It was not a casual gift. A sharpening stone of this quality cost real money. "You didn't need to," she said. "I know I didn't need to," he said. "I wanted to. There's a difference." She thought of Lenora Bellamy's letter. Leave it for whoever needs the place badly enough to stay. She thought of how people found each other, the strange, circuitous routes by which someone's stubbornness ended up being recognized by exactly the right person at exactly the right time. Not because the world arranged itself kindly, because stubborn people, when they stayed in one place long enough, eventually found each other. "Thank you," she said. He waved it off and went back to examining her joinery on the current project. That was all. That was enough. The conversation with Red Hollow that she'd been expecting happened in January, and it happened differently from how she'd imagined. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a gathering, not a formal one. Nothing organized, but the kind of organic clustering that happened in Edna's store on a slow, cold afternoon when 3 in at the same time. And conversation found its own direction. Maren was there to collect her order book, and there were several other people in the store, and the topics arrived in those situations, without a clear point of origin. Someone she thought it was Aldous Crane, though she wasn't certain, said something about the Bellamy property, and someone else said something about the curse, and then a third person, who had clearly already heard the revised version of the story, said that apparently the curse wasn't exactly what people had said, and then the room was looking at Maren. She set her order book down, she told them, not dramatically, not with any particular rhetorical shape designed to make them feel a certain way. She told them what Lenora had written in the letter: the well, the storm, the 11 years of carrying water, the decision to stay after Edmund died, the box under the flagstone, and what it was intended for. Most of its windows were dark. She told them what the well looked like when she'd arrived and what it looked like after she'd cleared it, and what the water tasted like when it finally ran clean. She told them about the cracked roof and the rebuilt walls and the storm in October and the roof standing after. She told them that Lenora Bellamy had spent 31 years on that land and had never abandoned it, had in fact spent her last years preparing it for whoever came next. Most of its windows were dark, and that the story about Blackthorn Claim being a cursed and deadly place was a story that had grown in the absence of information and had been wrong from the start. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Widow Heston, whose chairs Maren had repaired in the autumn, the woman in her 60s who always wore a particular gray wool coat, said she was out there alone for all those years, and none of us knew. No, Maren said. We should have known. The woman said it with the direct honesty of someone who had arrived at a conclusion quickly and wasn't going to soften it. Someone should have gone and checked. Yes, Maren said. Someone should have. There was a silence that had a different quality from the earlier, one heavier, more personal. The silence of a group of people sitting with something that reflected unfavorably on the collective history and knowing it. Just its windows were dark. She wasn't going to make it easier for them. She wasn't going to say it was all right, that no one could be blamed, that these things happened. It had not been all right. But she was also not going to stand in Edna Crowell's store and prosecute anyone, because that wasn't what she was here for, and it wasn't what the moment actually needed. What it means now, she said, is that the property is restored, and the well is working, and the story is wrong, and the people who come after Lenora Bellamy don't have to be afraid of a piece of land that was never dangerous. She picked up her order book. That's what it means now. Garrett, who had been at the back of the group and who she would not have expected Tick to say anything, said, "The chairs she fixed are holding." He said it to no one in particular. Widow Heston's chairs. I saw them last week. The repair work is good. It was not a profound contribution to the conversation, but it was Garrett acknowledging something in the only way Garrett seemed to know how to acknowledge things, through practical observation, through the evidence of work done well, and she registered it as such. She walked out of the store into the January cold, and she stood on the main street of Red Hollow for a moment in the winter light, and she thought, that's done. Not perfectly. Nothing was ever done perfectly. There were people in that room who were going to continue having complicated feelings about this for some time, and the story would continue to get simplified and distorted as it passed between people, and there would be versions of it she wouldn't recognize and couldn't control. That was the nature of stories in communities. You told the truth as clearly as you could, and then you let it go and lived in a way that confirmed it or didn't. She intended to live in a way that confirmed it. Spring came to Blackthorn the way it came to desert places, not gradually, not with the soft transition of wetter climates, but in a series of specific arrivals. One morning the light was winter thin, and the next it had a different weight to it, a warmth that had substance rather than just brightness. The ground changed under your feet, that particular give. That meant the frost had broken. The garden beds, which she'd amended through winter with composted material she'd been building up in the cleared area east of the workshop, were ready earlier than she'd expected. She planted on the first good day. Working through the morning on her knees in the soil, and it was different from the previous year's planting. Last year she'd been planting in hope, in the thin, desperate hope of someone who needed the land to cooperate, because there wasn't much margin if it didn't. This year she was planting with knowledge, the knowledge of a first season's results, of what this specific soil did with specific varieties, of where the sun fell longest and where the moisture held best. She made different decisions, better decisions. She was tamping down the last bean mound when she heard Beckett's horse on the road. He'd been coming out in the mornings more often, through late winter, not always. He had his stable work. And she had hers, but regularly enough that the sound of his horse on the desert road had become a familiar piece of the morning's texture. He tied the horse and came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her in the garden. First planting, he said. First planting, she confirmed. He sat on the low stone border of the bed opposite her and looked at the planted rows. Same arrangement as last year? Adjusted. I moved the squash to the west end. Last year, it got too much afternoon shade from the house wall. Should have been obvious from the start. You didn't know the house last year, he said. She looked up at him. That's generous. It's accurate. He picked up a small stone from the ground and turned it in his fingers. I talked to Hartley, she waited, about taking on more responsibility at the stable. He'd been managing everything alone since his son left, and he's not young. He wants someone he trusts to handle the day-to-day, and he's willing to pay for it. Beckett set the stone down. It would mean I'd have more stable income, more predictable. He was looking at the planted rows rather than at her. It would also mean I'd still be in Red Hollow, not further out, which means I could still come here regular. He still wasn't looking at her. Beckett, she said. He looked up. That sounds like a good position, she said. You should take it. I wanted to tell you first, he said. That's all. I wanted you to know the reasoning. She understood the reasoning. He was building something, too, in his own way, not a homestead, but a life that held together. A life that had shape and direction, rather than just a job that paid enough to live on. He was thinking about a future in which regular visits to Blackthorn Claim were a sustainable part of the structure. He wasn't stating that explicitly because they had not arrived at explicit statements yet, and she was not in a hurry to force language onto something that was still finding its form. But she understood it. Take the position, she said again. It's the right thing. He nodded. Something in his shoulder settled. They worked in the garden for the rest of the morning. They worked in the rest of not on the same tasks. She was planting, and he spent the time improving the irrigation channels she'd built along the lower bed edge, deepening them slightly to better direct the water from the well bucket she used for hand watering. He worked with the quiet purposefulness she'd come to know well, not narrating what he was doing, just doing it. By noon, the garden was planted, and the channels were improved, and the sun was high enough that working in it was more punishing than productive. She made coffee. They sat on the finished porch, the real porch, the one she'd rebuilt properly with the new posts and the fitted railings. The boards cut and planed, and fitted the way her father had taught her, level and tight, and they drank it in the sun. Cyrus came in March, just before the spring growth broke the surface of the garden beds. He came earlier in the day than usual, arriving before she'd finished her morning work at the bench. And there was something different about his manner. She came out to meet him, not worse, but weightier, the manner of a man who has made a decision and has come to see it through. He sat in his chair by the hearth. She sat in hers. She gave him coffee because that was simply what happened when Cyrus sat down, and she thought he might have been obscurely offended if she'd failed to produce it. I'm leaving the eastern hills, he said. She was still for a moment. When spring, month or two. I've been out there 40 years. He held his cup. My knees are filing legal briefs. And there's he paused in the way he paused when he was deciding how much to say. There's a woman in Santa Setla who's been writing me letters for 6 years, and I've been writing back. And I think it's time I stopped writing and went and sat in a room with her and figured out what that means. Maren looked at him. Cyrus Wren, weathered and compressed and blunt, who had lived alone in the desert hills for 40 years, who had stopped a girl on the street and told her she was going to make a fatal mistake, who had come back and stayed 3 days and taught her things she hadn't known. She needed Cyrus as been writing letters for 6 years. 6 years, she said. I met her in Santa Sela when I came through for supplies, he said, with the particular embarrassment of someone who is embarrassed not by the fact, but by discussing it. We talked for a long time. She's a sensible woman. Practical. She runs a small print shop. A pause. She has strong opinions about mortar ratios too, which I did not expect. Maren almost laughed. It was the closest she came. You should go, she said. I know I should go. I'm telling you I'm going. He looked around the main room of the house, the same slow taking in she'd watched him do each time he came. The glass windows, the straight walls. Edmund Bellamy's hawk in the south window, the workshop visible through the interior door, the bench surface worn already with the marks of serious work. You don't need me anymore, he said, not unkindly, just accurately, in the way Cyrus was almost always accurate. You haven't needed me since November. I've needed you differently since November, she said. He looked at her. There's a difference between needing someone to teach you a thing and needing someone to remind you that what you've built is real, she said. You did both. He was quiet for a long moment. Lenora would have liked you, he said finally, which was what he'd said about Edmund back in the autumn, and she understood now that it was the highest compliment Cyrus Wren had in his vocabulary, not that you were impressive or skilled or admirable, but that the particular dead people he'd loved Would have recognized you as worth knowing. I hope so, she said. He left after noon. He shook her hand at the door, actually shook it. A formal, deliberate gesture that neither of them made any comment about, and he got on his horse and rode the desert road back toward Red Hollow and the eastern hills beyond it. She watched him go. She stood on the porch of Blackthorn Claim in the March light, with her hands at her sides, and she watched until he was out of sight. And then she stood for a while, longer, looking at the desert road that had carried so many things to her and away from her over the past months. She was not sad exactly. She was something more complicated than sad, the feeling of a necessary chapter close, the bitter sweetness of a good ending that you couldn't have reached without the middle that preceded it. Cyrus Wren was going to sit in a room with a woman who had strong opinions about mortar ratios. The world was genuinely strange. The evening she had been thinking about without knowing she was thinking about. It happened in late April. Spring had arrived fully. By then the garden was up, the corn knee-high, the bean tendrils beginning their reach toward the corn stalks, the way her mother's notes had described, finding their support in exactly the way the design intended. The well ran sweet and steady. The workshop had a 3-week waiting list for repair work, which was a situation she was navigating by being more selective about what she took and directing simpler jobs toward a teenager in Red Hollow named Harris, who had good hands and had been coming out twice a month to learn basic joinery from her, which was an arrangement that had begun as practical necessity and had become something she found unexpectedly rewarding, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Teaching was different from doing. When you taught someone a thing, you had to understand it at a different level than when you simply executed it, and understanding things at that different level made better at executing them. Her father had known this. He'd spent hours explaining to her why things were done certain ways, not just how, and she'd thought it was about passing knowledge on. She was beginning to understand that it was also about the teacher. The evening in late April, she had finished the last job of the day, a complicated piece of furniture repair that had required inventing a small tool to reach an interior joint that nothing in her kit had the right geometry for. She'd made the tool from a piece of rod stock and a spare chisel blade, fitted and brazed, and the joint was solid, and the tool had worked, and the piece solid, and to cure and cleaned her bench, and washed her hands and walked through the house to the front porch. The sun was going down in the desert way fast in total, the kind of sunset that went from gold to deep red to purple in less time than it felt like it should take, as though the desert had no patience for gradual transitions. The sky was enormous above the flat expanse of the territory, the kind of sky that made a person feel their own particular scale without being crushing about it, just honest, the way the desert was honest, the way she'd come to appreciate the desert's honesty, even when it was inconvenient. She sat in the chair she'd built for the porch, a better chair than the one inside. She'd had more time and more skills when she made it. The joints tighter, the angles worked out through an actual calculation rather than intuition, and she put her father's dovetail saw across her knees. She did this sometimes, not for any mystical reason, just because the weight of it was familiar, in a way that very few things in her life had been consistently familiar, and familiarity had a value she hadn't fully appreciated until she'd spent a period of her life without much of it. She put Edmund Bellamy's hawk on the porch railing beside her. It looked out at the desert with the carved eyes of something that had been made to look outward, and she looked out with it, and the evening light did what evening light did in that place, pulling everything into a clarity that the harsher daylight obscured. She thought about her father, about the saw and what it meant, not as symbol, not as sentiment, but as simple physical fact. He had used this saw for 20 years before she was born, and 10 years after, and his hands had worn the handle into its current shape, and she had been using it long enough now that her grip and his were probably indistinguishable in the worn places. That was one kind of continuity, not grand, just real. She thought about Lenora Bellamy, who had sat on a porch like this one, maybe this very porch, before the posts rotted and it collapsed, and looked at the same desert and made the same calculation about staying. Not because it was easy, because she'd decided it was hers, and walking away would mean it had beaten her, and she wasn't willing to be beaten. She heard them on the road before she saw them. 2 horses. The sound of Beckett's she could identify it now, a particular rhythm in the gait, and another that she recognized after a moment as the slightly heavier footfall of Cyrus's dun animal, which surprised her because Cyrus had said he was leaving in a month or two, and a month or two was not yet up, apparently. They came over the last rise in the road, and she could see them in the evening light, 2 riders on the desert road coming toward Blackthorn Claim, and she sat in her porch chair with the saw on her knees and the hawk on the railing, and she watched them come. She thought about Orson Whitlock, who had given her $20 and turned back to his newspaper. She had not hated him for it. In the end, she'd sorted through it enough times over the winter to understand that what he'd done was not malicious. It was simply the act of a man who had never learned that the people who required least from him were often the ones doing the most work, and that invisibility was not the same as not being there. But she did not need his understanding. She had outgrown the shape of his household. She thought about what she had now and what it had cost. The answer to the second part was everything she had. Every cent, every calloused layer on her hands. Every day she hadn't been certain whether the next problem was going to be the one that broke the experiment. The well descent, the beam raise, the storm. The first conversation with Edna. The confrontation in the store that hadn't been a confrontation. The long winter of work and planning, and the particular loneliness of lying awake at 3 a.m, understanding exactly how much could still go wrong. The answer to the first part was harder to fit into simple terms. She had a house that was hers, built correctly, that had held through a desert's storm, because she'd learned from a woman she'd never met, and an old prospector who'd stopped her on a street corner, and a young man who knew that braced brackets were better than staked legs. She had a workshop that produced steady income from work she was actually good at. She had a garden in its second year, already better than the first. She had a well full of sweet cold water. She had an order book with 3 weeks of future work in it, and a teenager who was learning to cut a clean dovetail joint. She had a hawk that looked out at the desert with carved eyes, left by a man who had wanted to give his homesick wife something to look at during a hard winter. She had a letter in a tin box that she would keep until she died, and probably pass on to whoever came after her, because the letter deserved to keep moving forward through time. She had people who came down the desert road toward her in the evening because they wanted to be here, not because they were obligated. Beckett raised a hand in greeting when he saw her on the porch. Cyrus, beside him, did the Cyrus version of the same thing, which was a slight lift of his chin that communicated more than most people's full gestures. She raised a hand back. The desert evening settled around them in the way it settled, enormous and indifferent, and beautiful in the spare way that things were beautiful when they didn't need to be anything other than what they were. The first stars were becoming visible in the east. The garden was green against the pale ground. The well cover was weighted and sound. The roof held its lines against the darkening sky. She remained the same heavyset young woman who had walked into Red Hollow with $20 and a saw and nowhere to go. She had not become something else. She had not needed to become something else. What she'd needed was what Lenora Bellamy had understood and written down in a letter she'd sealed for whoever came next. Not a different person, but the right circumstances to show what the person already was. The right circumstances sometimes had to be built by hand. She had built them. Beckett and Cyrus tied their horses at the post and came up to the porch, and she went inside to put more water on for coffee because that was what you did. When people you trusted came to your door in the evening, and the fire in the hearth was still going the way it had been going every evening since the first night she'd lit it with shaking hands and a flint, and 3 tries steady, functional, honest, sufficient. Blackthorn Claim's windows were lit from inside. Red Hollow could see them from the road. Nobody was laughing anymore.